Welcome, everyone, this is your friend, here with another exciting fanfiction. Today, we're diving into the story of, what if Tony Stark became Peter Parker's guardian after May? If you enjoy this video, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more fanfiction content just like this. Now, let's get started with the fanfic, Chapter 1. Peter and May Parker practically bolted out of the theater to beat the rush of people that was sure to come out behind them. It was a Friday night, and school was coming to a close on Monday for the summer. So, May decided to treat her nephew to a movie of his choice for successfully completing his sophomore year of high school. Originally, Peter was going to see if Ned wanted to join them, but he decided against it as it was a nice chance for him to spend quality time with his aunt. Between him being Spider-Man, being in school, spending time with Ned and MJ, participating on the decathlon team, spending time with Tony Stark, and May working a lot, it was hard to set aside time for just the two of them. Thankfully, this particular Friday night was just the perfect opportunity to get that quality time. Unfortunately, it had begun storming as they were walking to May's car, so they both got soaked. However, neither Peter nor May minded. This was a special night for aunt and nephew. Nothing was going to ruin it. "You know, maybe we should just park closer to the theater next time," Peter said, laughing as they got into the car. "Maybe we should just have Mr. Stark invent jets or rockets so that I can park in the air next time," May retorted as she put the car in reverse. Peter couldn't help but laugh at the mention of his mentor, Tony Stark, also famously known as Iron Man and a member of the Avengers. It had been 10 months since the Vulture incident and since Peter turned down Tony's offer to join the Avengers, and surprisingly, ever since then, Peter and Tony had been slowly getting to know one another, becoming closer. The picture they took together at Stark Industries to, as Tony put it, provide more evidence that Peter completed the Stark internship, and when Tony boosted his confidence to MJ that same day seemed to act as the domino effect for them. They had been through a lot together in such a short amount of time, and after May found out about Peter being Spider-Man all those months ago, she of course became more aware of how much Peter looked up to Tony Stark and admired him, and how much Tony came to care about her nephew. "Aunt May," Peter suddenly said, jolting May out of her thoughts, "are you okay?" "Oh yeah, I'm fine, sweetheart," May said as she started the car. "Just lost in thought, that's all." "You sure?" "Yeah, baby, very sure." She gently reached out and ran a hand through his brown hair. Peter could only smile and nodded, blushing a little at May calling him baby. "So, when is the next time you're going to Mr. Stark?" she asked as they turned onto the street. "Monday, after school lets out," Peter replied. "He's got some new ideas for my suit in the nanotechnology project, and he wants to run some tests. Actually, he texted me earlier today about that. He said that after we work in the lab, he wants to take you, Happy, Pepper, Colonel Rhodes, Vision, and me out to dinner, to celebrate me finishing the year." "Tell him I think that's a great idea," May replied, smiling. "Awesome," Peter said excitedly, making a mental note to text Tony tomorrow that his aunt was on board with his plans for Monday. "I'm glad you changed your mind about him." May smiled at her nephew. She wasn't afraid to admit that she wasn't Tony's biggest fan at first when he suddenly came to their apartment a year ago and whisked Peter away on a retreat for the internship a whole month later. However, he was finally growing on her as she saw how great he was with Peter, even acting as a father figure to him. She couldn't help but wonder if he realized he was acting like that or if it just happened naturally, much like how she and her later husband, Ben, acted when Peter came to live with them after his parents, Ben's brother and his wife, died. "Well, just remember not to tell him that," she finally said. "It could inflate that big ego of his." Peter laughed yet again and shook his head. "Don't worry," he said, "your secret's safe with me." May widened her smile as she reached over and ruffled his hair, earning a chuckle from Peter in return. Both aunt and nephew fell into a comfortable silence as May continued to drive through the various intersections to get back to their Queens apartment. Peter leaned his head back against the headrest as he looked out the window, watching the buildings roll past them, and he couldn't help but think about his Uncle Ben, May's husband and his dad's younger brother, and how he used to take him and May to the movies on Friday nights. He would always sit in the backseat and watch the buildings and the people rolling past them. "What do you think Ben would have thought of Mr. Stark?" Peter finally asked. May sighed with exaggeration, earning a chuckle from her nephew. I don't know," she replied. I mean when he became Iron Man, it was all over the news that he was shutting down the weapons division in Stark Industries and that he was destroying them wherever they were used. Peter nodded. He was only 7 years old going on 8 when Tony was kidnapped in Afghanistan, and while he wasn't old enough to care about the news, he remembered that that was all people, especially Ben and May, talked about. When Tony finally came home 3 months later, it increased tenfold when Tony announced that he was no longer going to make weapons for a living, and that had to be the exact moment where Peter started to idolize the billionaire. Then that idolization increased when Tony revealed that he was Iron Man, but he never thought about how Ben reacted to that. I just remember Ben, well, being impressed and maybe even shocked. I mean, you got to understand that Tony was painted as this war profiteer, and then, he became this genius billionaire playboy philanthropist? Peter finished. Yes, May laughed, and seeing that type of person taking on a role that involves helping people, it shocked everyone. But Ben, he saw what Mr. Stark was doing, and he really came to respect him, especially when he saw how much he looked up to him. After all, like he always said, with great power comes great responsibility, Peter finished again. Ben said that all the time, especially when he was a little kid. That motto was always something Peter tried to live by, especially after he died about a year ago. Exactly, May replied. That, and they have one other thing in common. What? They both care very deeply about you. Peter smiled at his aunt's statement. Of course, he knew Ben loved him with all his heart just as he loved him, but it was nice to also hear his aunt acknowledge how much Tony cared about him. There was a small part of Peter that saw the ironclad superhero as a father figure, and it would be impossible not to. They had been through a lot together in these past 10 months. Not that he would actually admit that to May or Tony. Surely, they would find that weird. Tony and Peter weren't biologically related, after all, so it didn't make sense as to why they would see each other as father and son. The rookie superhero was jolted out of his thoughts when he and May stopped at a red light. He felt something, a small tingling, his spider sense. Peter immediately sat up and looked around, surveying the intersection looking for any signs of danger. Peter, sweetheart, what's wrong? May asked, trying to keep an eye on the red light. I don't know, Peter said as he scanned the intersection. It's my sense, I guess, but I don't see anything. Well, maybe, May tried to say something only to be interrupted by a horn honking behind them. They looked behind them only to see that there was another car right behind them, and they could see the driver urging them to go. May turned back around only to see that the light turned green. Let me know if I need to pull over when it gets worse, she said as she pressed gently on the gas pedal, moving the car forward. The car moved into the intersection. Peter's spider sense began to tingle even more, causing him to grunt and grab the back of his neck. What he saw next seemed to occur in Hen came straight toward them while they were in the middle of the intersection. May, he shouted. Crash! Peter felt his head bang against something, and then everything went black. Pain was the first thing that registered in Peter's head as he came to. He groaned as he opened his brown eyes, trying to get rid of the blurry vision and the headache that came with it, and as soon as he was able to focus, he noticed that he was still in the car, which he thought was good because he didn't remember getting out of the car or even coming back to the apartment. He looked up and furrowed his eyebrows together at what he saw. The car window on his side of the car was cracked, and it was then he felt something on the side of his head. He brought up a shaking hand to the wet spot and was able to feel a cut, or a gash on his head. He brought his hand away and saw blood on his fingertips, and that was when it all came back to him. He and May were driving home from the movie theater. His spider sense went off, his aunt was driving, and their light was green, and someone crashed into them. Aunt May, Peter asked, turning to his left expecting to see May waking up. However, all he found was his aunt in her seat, completely still with multiple injuries. Eh? His heart began to pound as he moved to get a closer look, but the seatbelt anchored him to the seat. Shit, he tried to release the seatbelt, but he found that it was jammed. Come on, Spider-Man, he whispered to himself as he used his super strength to break the seatbelt out of the back. As soon as he was free, he leaned over to his aunt. He could see that she was lying very still in her seat. Her airbags had been deployed too. May, are you okay? No answer. May, Peter shouted as he shook her shoulder. Within seconds, sirens and more lights surrounded them. Peter looked around and saw that police cars and ambulances were coming from all directions. Help had come, but Peter was confused. He didn't remember calling 911, and he looked down. His phone was on the floor of the car, and he quickly bent down to pick it up. Someone who saw the accident must have called for help. "Help is here, May," Peter said to his unconscious aunt. He was much too relieved to notice that his aunt was still not answering. A flashlight suddenly shined in his face. "Kid, are you okay?" a voice shouted. Peter put his hand up to shield his face and could see that it was police officer. "Yeah, but my aunt, she's unconscious," Peter replied. He probably should have mentioned his head, but he could care less about his head. He just wanted May to be okay. "Okay, sit tight," the officer replied. "We'll get you two out of here." Peter nodded and watched as some firemen came up on either side of the car with some tools. He couldn't really see what they were using, but suddenly, he began to hear loud drilling noises from outside. Then within seconds, they managed to get the doors opened on both sides, and next thing Peter knew, the firemen practically dragged him out of the car. The rookie superhero noted that he could have easily ripped the doors off with his super strength, but that was the last thing he was worried about at the moment as the paramedics rushed over and dragged him to the ambulance waiting nearby. He tried to see if May was being helped as well, but he barely had any time to react as he was brought into the ambulance and sat down on a gurney with the paramedic in front of him. "They're going to take care of my aunt, right?" Peter quickly asked as the paramedic inspected the gash in his head. "Of course they will," the paramedic replied. "We're going to take you to the Mount Sinai Queen's Hospital. Can you tell me your name, sweetheart?" "Peter Parker," he answered quickly. He wasn't sure if it was the adrenaline, or his super strength or enhanced healing, or a concussion, but his head didn't hurt that much. He felt a dull ache, but that was it, even as the paramedic poked at the gash. "Nice to meet you, Peter," the paramedic replied. "My name is Lexi. Can you tell me where you live?" 15th Street in Queens, Peter replied quickly. "I live there with my Aunt May." He knew that wasn't the question, but it couldn't hurt. "Okay, where do you go to school?" Lexi asked as she got in front of Peter, inspecting his eyes. "Midtown School of Science and Technology," Peter replied. Lexi nodded, clearly glad that Peter was able to answer the questions. "Okay, I'm going to shine my flashlight," she said as she took out a flashlight and turned it on. "I just need you to hold still for a minute. I'm just checking to see if you have a concussion." Peter nodded as he felt the ambulance driving away. Lexi shined the light, and the rookie superhero felt his headache increase. "Does that bother you?" Lexi asked. "Why yeah, I have a bit of a headache," Peter replied. "Okay, you might have a mild concussion," Lexi stated as she wrote something down on a notepad, "but we're going to get to the hospital soon to get you checked out. Can you tell me what you remember?" Why yeah, Peter began. He wanted to ask Lexi again about May going to the same hospital as them, but he figured he could just ask after he answered Lexi's question. "Well, May and we were driving home after seeing a movie, and he stopped. It would probably be best for him to mention his spider sense, felt sick, or something. We were stopped at a red light, and someone behind us beeped. We went at a green light, but then someone rammed into us on May's side of the car. Next thing I knew, I was waking up in the car, and my aunt was unconscious. That was when you guys came." "Okay," Lexi replied, nodding and taking Peter's story in. "Well, we should be at the hospital soon." In the meantime, the young woman took out a roll of gauze and began to wrap it around Peter's head. "I want you to lie down." She gently guided Peter to lie down on the gurney. "Okay, and you promise that my aunt will be there?" Peter asked quickly, "right?" "Of course, I'm sure she's waiting for you," Lexi replied. "You'll get to see her once you two get checked over, okay?" "Okay," Peter replied, nodding. Within minutes, Peter found himself being wheeled into the ER at Mount Sinai Queens. Although, he wasn't sure why since he was able to walk just fine. Maybe it was for precaution, but that didn't matter to Peter at the moment. He scanned the ER hoping to find any sign of May as the medical team rushed around him to get him into a room. "May!" Peter shouted, looking around. No answer and no sign of her. Now, he was starting to worry. Had she been taken to another hospital? Or what if? Peter's heart pounded at his next thought, and he shook his head. He refused to accept it. It couldn't be. She had to be okay, she had to be. "May, where are you, Aunt May?" Peter shouted again. Again, no answer and no sign of her. Before he could try again, he wheeled behind a curtain and helped onto a bed. Where was May? Chapter 2. Peter wasn't sure what time it was. Time seemed to have vanished ever since the accident that night, and he wasn't sure how long he had been in the bed for. However, he had a feeling that it had to be at least a few hours, maybe a little less. He had no clue as to the doctor and nurse finally finished stitching the gash on his head and wrapping thick gauze around it. The rookie superhero figured that the adrenaline must have worn off because now his head had begun to hurt even more, but that still didn't matter to Peter. He still had no clue as to where his aunt was. May still had yet to call or text him, and surely, she would have after they were both separated at the scene of the accident. "Okay, Peter," the nurse said as she and the doctor stepped back after tending to his wound. "You're all set. I'm just going to give some meds," the doctor, Dr. Bailey explained, smiling at him. "Is there someone we can call for you?" "Yeah, my Aunt May Parker," Peter suddenly replied, relieved that now, he was finally going to get an answer as to where May was. "I told the paramedic that she was in the accident too, and I hadn't seen her since. The paramedic told me that she was coming here too, but I haven't even heard from her. I really need to." It's all right, Peter," Dr. Bailey replied. "I'll go to the front desk and find out where she is, okay? You'll get to see her soon." Peter nodded quickly before the doctor and the nurse finally left to go find his aunt. He leaned back against the pillows, aching for any answers regarding May, aching for her to come running through the curtains completely okay, giving him a huge hug, and taking him home so that they could forget this ever happened. Although, they didn't have a car. Maybe they could get a taxi or an Uber? Maybe Happy would pick them up? "Peter," a voice suddenly said, jolting the teenager out of his thoughts. He had been moved to another room while the doctor went to go find out where May was. Now, the doctor finally came back to his room. And hope increased tenfold as he eagerly sat up and waited for his aunt to come in from behind him. However, his hopes were dashed pretty quickly as another doctor came in from behind instead. As annoyed as he was, he couldn't help but feel worried as he noted the sad look on their faces. "Peter, Dr. Bailey began. This is Dr. Becker." He gestured to the female doctor behind him. Dr. Becker looked to be in her early 50s with long brown hair tied back in a bun. She also had big glasses and was dressed in a white coat like Dr. Bailey. Hi, I am Peter," the teenager replied, holding his hand out to shake. "It's nice to meet you, Peter," Dr. Becker said as she shook his hand. "I was in charge of your aunt's case." "Oh," Peter said as he sat up a little more. "Well, where is she? Is she okay? I mean, she was unconscious in the car after the accident, but did she wake up? What room is she in?" "Well, actually," Dr. Becker said as she sat down in a chair next to Peter's bed, your aunt, the paramedics found that she had a faint pulse after the accident. Her injuries were severe, and we tried to help her. However, she flatlined during surgery, and we tried to get her heart started again." "Tried?" Peter uttered as the worry increased tenfold. He silently prayed that this wasn't what he was beginning to think it was. Dr. Becker nodded. "Peter, I'm very sorry," she began, shaking her head, "but your aunt passed away. There was nothing more we could do for her." Within seconds, Peter felt his entire world come crashing down around him. What? Peter uttered as his brown eyes widened. He felt ice-cold terror and shock wash over him. "And no, she can't be." He couldn't dare to say the word, or even think it. No, there must be some mistake. She's not gone. It's got to be another May Parker. "Peter, I know this is a huge shock," Dr. Bailey began, "but..." "No," Peter suddenly shouted as tears welled up in his eyes. "No, she can't be. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to shout, but he sniffled as a tear fell down his cheek. "She can't be gone. She's all I have left," he thought to himself. Peter couldn't finish that last statement as he finally gave in and began to sob, bowing his head and grabbing handfuls of his brown hair. "I'm so sorry, Peter," he heard Dr. Bailey say. The teenager was so distraught as he continued to cry, but he barely noticed that Dr. Bailey actually sounded sincere. Perhaps it was good bedside manner, or maybe he's been through something like his situation. He couldn't believe this was happening. His Aunt May was gone. May was gone. He felt so wrong for thinking this. There was no way it could be true. After his parents died a long time ago when he was 4 years old, he went to live with his Aunt May and Uncle Ben. And then after Ben died almost 2 years ago, it was just him and May. She promised that he would never be alone, that she would always be there for him. How could she just be gone? How could she just leave him? "See, can I see her?" Peter finally asked. He couldn't believe it. He didn't want to believe it. There was no way it was true. Maybe if he saw her, he could figure out if it was in fact his aunt. That was probably what happened with his aunt. Maybe there was a mix-up of some sorts. "Of course, we'll take you to her," Dr. Becker replied. "We haven't moved her yet, so she's in a room." "But we do have to ask, Peter," Dr. Bailey asked. "Is there anyone who you can call? We couldn't find anyone in Aunt May's emergency contacts." Peter could only shake his head despite how much he wanted to protest that May wasn't dead. "No," he said despondently, "she's all I have left in my family." He racked his brain trying to think of anyone else, but there's no one he could think of at the moment. Dr. Bailey nodded in understanding, and Peter couldn't help but notice that he seemed afraid that that was his answer. "Okay," he said. "We'll take you to see your aunt then." Peter trailed behind the two doctors as they moved down the hall from his room, and his heart pounded as they walked further down the hall. There was a part of him that was relieved that he was going to see May, but there was another part of him that was utterly scared. The doctors had just told him that his aunt was dead, that May was dead, killed in the car accident tonight. His heart pounded even more at the thought of his aunt lying so still with her eyes closed. The mere thought of him not seeing her again made him sick to his stomach. May would never do that to him. She wouldn't just leave him like that, not now when they needed each other, when they were supposed to have more time together. "She's in here, Peter," Dr. Becker said, jolting Peter out of his thoughts. He could see the solemn expression on her face, and he immediately felt tears welling up in his eyes, fighting the urge to accept his aunt was truly gone. "It's going to look like she's sleeping, and you can take as much time as you need. We're going to send someone to talk to you in a bit," Dr. Bailey added before Peter had a chance to respond. "They're going to wait out here for you, okay?" Peter could only nod. Words escaped him at the moment. There was nothing to say. The doctors must have sensed that because Dr. Bailey turned and simply opened the door for Peter, allowing him to walk in. The teenager's brain was screaming at him to stop and to run the other direction, away from the doctors, away from the room, but his feet kept moving into the room. He wished he could stop, but it was all in vain. As soon as he walked in, he saw her, lying in bed, completely still. There were no machines or monitors around her. The room was empty except him, May, and the bed and some furniture. Tears welled up in his eyes as he laid his eyes on May. Her eyes were closed, like she was sleeping as the doctor said, and he took a few more steps closer. "May," he finally said through a sob. He sniffed as he sagged at his aunt. There was no answer. "Aunt May, please. May. Wake up. Please, don't let this be true." He sniffled again, waiting for an answer, for her to open her eyes and to end this waking nightmare. But nothing came. Peter sniffled again. Aunt May. See, can you hear me? It's Peter," he sniffled. May, please. Why you can't, and not like Uncle Ben." Again, no answer. Peter sniffled and let out a sob as he rested his head on May's chest, crying even harder when he heard no heartbeat. "Please, Aunt May," he whispered through his sobs. "Please, don't leave me, and not you, too. First, his parents, then Uncle Ben, and now, Aunt May." He gripped May's arms tightly, sobbing, willing her to come back, to take him home away from this hospital, but when that didn't happen, he continued to cry. Peter jolted and opened his eyes. "May?" He blinked a few times only to see a woman standing over him. She had white hair tied back into a bun, blue eyes, and a navy blue suit on. Peter immediately figured he must have fallen asleep because he didn't remember her walking into the room. Plus, he was feeling groggy and thought it was his aunt, completely forgetting that she was in the bed, dead. She smiled at him with pity. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to scare you," she said. "My name is Danielle Walker. I'm a social worker." Peter slowly sat up at that statement as he widened his eyes, and that was when it hit him. May was his last living relative. There was no one else to take him in. He was an orphan, and he belonged to the state of New York. His heart began to pound. Oh, he said. The social worker must have sensed his uneasiness, as she pulled up a chair to sit down in front of him. "It's okay," she said. "I just want to talk to you for a little bit. The doctors told me about your aunt." She kept her eyes focused on Peter, not once looking at May's body. "I'm very sorry for your loss." Thank you," Peter replied. He snuck a look at May as tears rolled down his face before he quickly wiped them away, turning back to Mrs. Walker. "Is there somewhere else you would like to go to talk, Peter?" she asked gently. "We can maybe—" No, Peter said quickly. He felt a little bad for shooting down the offer as quickly as he did, but he wasn't ready to leave May just yet. Plus, what if she tried to take him away to her agency? No, he couldn't let that happen. "I am okay here." "Okay," Mrs. Walker said, nodding. "Well, I know this has been a difficult night for you, but I need to talk to you about your living arrangements. The doctors tell me that they didn't know who to contact in terms of next of kin. Is there?" No, Peter answered sadly, shaking his head. My aunt was the only family I had left." He hung his head low. Mrs. Walker sighed sadly. "Then, you will need to be." "No," Peter suddenly said, looking back up at the social worker. "No, please, Mrs. Walker. You can't send me into the system. Please. I don't want to go live in a foster home." He knew that the social worker was just doing her job, and he understood that. However, the thought of living with complete strangers after living his only family for so long, the thought of moving away from New York, possibly away from MJ, Ned, Tony, made him sick to his stomach. Peter, Mrs. Walker said, trying to remain calm for the teenager. "I know it's a lot to take in, but you're only 15. You can't live on your own. I have some families who will." "No, please," Peter interjected pleadingly as tears formed in his eyes again. "Please, I'm begging you, Mrs. Walker. Don't send me into the system." Okay, calm down," Mrs. Walker said, holding her hand up to calm the teenager. "We don't have to talk about it right now." "Then why are we talking about it now?" Peter thought to himself. Nevertheless, he nodded slowly, sighing in relief. "We can talk about it when you're thinking more clearly," Mrs. Walker continued. "However, you will need a place to stay with in the meantime. Is there someone you trust to let you stay with them for the time being?" Peter racked his brain despite the dull ache, trying to think of anybody he could call. Ned, his best friend, was an option, but there was no way he could impose on Ned's parents. Not only that, but he wasn't in the right mind to answer questions from Ned. MJ was another option. As blunt as she was, she would know better to give him space for the night, but he didn't know her parents as well as he knew Ned's. It would be too awkward. He quickly got out his phone as he felt the social worker's eyes on him. He scrolled through his contacts, trying to find someone who could help. Happy, Tony Stark's bodyguard, was in there, but Peter didn't find it in his heart to bother him. Although, he was a backup in case he couldn't find anyone else. He continued scrolling through his contacts. Finally, one name made him stop. Tony Stark. Call Mr. Stark. Whether the whisper was his own inner voice, or Aunt May's, Peter would never know, but it seemed like the best option he had. He had stayed over with Tony for a weekend last year when May went on a business trip, and he's been over there for their lab days and movie nights. Maybe Tony could let him stay for a day or two and help him get back on his feet to live on his own. Maybe he could work part-time at Stark Industries, after he filed for emancipation? "Did you think of someone?" the social worker asked. "Maybe," Peter said, "but it might be a long shot." He then remembered that one text from Tony from months ago. "You can text me anytime, whether you need my help or if maybe you just want to chat." Well, he definitely needed help. Without much thought, he tapped the number and brought the phone to his ear. It rang once, then twice, and then, "Hey, Peter," Tony said over the line as he answered. "Didn't think you'd be calling this late. How was the movie?" Relief washed over Peter as soon as he heard his mentor's voice. He also sounded like he had been working in the lab for quite a while. It didn't sound like he was waking up, which didn't make Peter feel any worse. Mr. Stark. Almost instantaneously, the tears returned in his eyes. He let out a shaky breath, and he could almost feel a shift in his mentor's voice. "Hey, you okay, kid?" Tony asked carefully. "Why do you sound like you're about to cry?" He and May had just gone to see a movie. Why would Peter call him so late at night about to cry? He wouldn't cry if he and May had a fight. He would just be venting to him and using some colorful language. Peter opened his mouth to explain what happened, but all that came about was a small sob as tears rolled down his face. He sniffed. I'm sorry, Mr. Stark. I didn't know who else to call. He sniffled again, placing a hand over his mouth trying to stop sobbing. It's okay, kid, Tony said gently, something that wasn't usually associated with Tony Stark unless you were in his inner circle. It's okay. You know you can always call me. Even though he knew Tony wouldn't see, Peter nodded his head as he sobbed again. Peter, Tony began, you're scaring me. What's going on? If the grief and all other mixed emotions weren't consuming him at the moment, he would have felt awful for scaring his mentor, but somehow, the teenaged superhero took a deep breath to stop himself from sobbing. Peter took another deep breath. I'm actually in the hospital right now. What? Tony shouted. Are you okay? What happened? Of course, he had to explain how he got there to begin with. As far as Tony knew, Peter and May had a movie night tonight and were supposed to have just gone home. Peter didn't plan on patrolling tonight. How could this night have gone from a night at the movies to a night at the hospital? Aunt May and I, Peter began, we were on our way home, and, this car, we got in a car accident. Jesus, Tony replied, are you two okay? You two, it obviously hadn't a curve happened, what clearly happened? Why yeah, I'm fine, Peter replied as tears rolled down his cheeks, but, May, he sobbed instinctively grasping May's hand next to him, my aunt. He sobbed again, Mr. Stark, she didn't make it. Oh my God, Tony said as shock dripped into his voice. Kid, I'm so sorry. He paused as if he was trying to figure out what he wanted to say. Hey, are you with anyone right now? Are you alone? No, there's a social worker here sitting with me right now, Peter replied. He had honestly forgotten about Mrs. Walker as he eyed her still sitting in the chair across from him. The doctor still has to clear me and give me some medicine. Friday, track Peter's phone and open my safe, Tony suddenly said, addressing his AI. There was another pause as he heard Tony fumbling around, clearly looking for something. Okay, sit tight, kid. I'm going to have Happy wait for me, okay? Whatever you do, don't leave with anyone. Okay, Peter said as more tears formed in his eyes as he sniffed. It's going to be okay, I promise, buddy, Tony replied. I hope you're right. Of course, I am. I always am, you know that. Despite the circumstances, Peter let out a little chuckle before sniffling again. Tony chuckled at his own comment. Hang in there, he replied. I'll be there soon with Happy. Thank you so much, Mr. Stark, Peter replied. Chapter 3. Tony couldn't remember the last time he ran so fast. Sure, he ran into battle as Iron Man, but that mostly involved flying. As soon as he hung up the phone with Peter, he got on the phone with Happy asking him, or rather demanding that he get the car ASAP to get to Mount Sinai Queen's Hospital. They needed to get to Peter right away. With the papers in his pocket, he ran down to the garage to meet Happy with the car, and then he got on the phone with his fiancée Pepper. Tony, what is it? Pepper asked with sleep in her voice when she picked up the phone. She was away on a business trip, and was coming home early tomorrow morning, which made Tony feel even worse for calling her so late in the evening. I'm so sorry for waking you up, Tony replied quickly as Happy drove from the tower, but I need you to get in touch with our lawyer and May Parker's lawyer. Why? Pepper asked as she woke up a little more clearly, a little perplexed that Tony was asking for her to call their lawyer, and May's lawyer in the middle of the night. What's going on? Peter just called me, Tony replied. I don't have time to get into details, but he and May were in a car accident tonight, and, May, he took a shaking breath, she didn't make it. Oh my God, Pepper said in shock as she sat up in bed. What about Peter? Is he okay? Happy and I are on our way to get him at the hospital, Tony replied. There's a social worker there with him ready to put him in the system, so I got the paperwork from a few months ago. Oh God, okay. Do what you need to do and get to him, Pepper instructed. I'll call Larry and May's lawyer. See if the social worker would be willing to meet up tomorrow morning. Tony felt some relief wash over him hearing the command in Pepper's voice. It was one of the million reasons why he made her the CEO of Stark Industries to begin with. You're a lifesaver, Pep, he finally said, relaxing somewhat. He would feel more relaxed once he had Peter beside him. I try, she said. She then paused. Tony, things are going to be different from now on. I know, Tony said, running a hand through his hair. I'm honestly surprised that I'm not having an attack right now. Pepper couldn't help but smile hearing the nervousness in his voice. You're a lot stronger than you think, she said. Pete's going to need you more than ever now, and happy, Rhodey, Vision, and I will support you in any way. Thanks, honey, Tony whispered, trying to push the nerves down. Let me know what happened with the lawyers. Of course. Call me when you get back to the tower. Will do. I love you. I love you, too. Tony barely had a chance to thank Happy and to tell him to wait in the car as he practically bolted out of the car and ran into the lobby of the emergency room. He mentally cursed himself for not asking Peter what wing or room he was in, but as soon as he ran in, he saw the receptionist staring him with widened eyes. Excuse me, he said, completely ignoring the shocked look on the woman's face. I'm Tony Stark. I'm looking for Peter Parker, 15 years old, brown hair, brown eyes, yay hi. He came in here after getting in an accident with his Aunt May Parker. Tony didn't show it, but he couldn't help but marvel at how he's known the kid for almost a year and Peter was rubbing off on him. Oh yes, Mr. Stark, the receptionist finally said, the social worker, she said that you would be coming. They're in room 206, and I believe the doctor is just about to clear him. Great, thank you, Tony replied quickly. He practically sprinted to the elevator, pushing the button to go up aggressively before the doors finally opened. His heart pounded as he jumped in and pushed the button to go to the second floor. His nervousness increased tenfold when the elevator finally opened to the floor as he clutched the paperwork in his hands, but he refused to let it cripple him now, when Peter needed him to come through. He refused to let this kid down on what was probably the worst night of his young life as he ran down the hall to find the room 206. Finally, he found room 206 and didn't hesitate to open the door, not even bothering to knock. There, he found Peter sitting on a bed with May, lying very still, and the social worker sitting in a chair across from Peter as if to prevent him from going anywhere. Peter clearly heard him come in as he suddenly looked up, allowing the veteran superhero to see his bloodshot eyes, and the gauze around his head. A clear indication that he had been hurt in the accident as well. However, Tony quickly realized that Peter didn't even mention that, but that didn't matter right now. He needed to focus on the kid, his mentee. Ah, kid, Tony trailed off as he stood there letting the door close behind him. He didn't know what to say for once. Mr. Stark, Peter replied as he watched his mentor walk over to him, feeling even more relief. He couldn't believe it, Tony actually came for him. Hey, buddy, Tony said as he crouched down in front of Peter with concern etched all over his face. He gripped Peter's elbows, searching the boy for any other injuries. Are you? It's just my head, don't worry, Peter quickly replied. The teenaged superhero was able to see that his mentor was wearing an AC/DC shirt and jeans instead of a suit and sunglasses. It was pretty obvious that Tony had been working in the lab when he called, and Peter wanted to apologize for making the man come all the way to the hospital. However, he didn't have the energy to do so. Mr. Stark, a voice suddenly said, interrupting the conversation. Tony looked up and saw the social worker mentally kicking himself for forgetting she was there. My name is Danielle Walker. I'm the social worker. Thank you for coming. Of course, Tony quickly replied, shaking her hand. Why don't we step outside for a moment? Mrs. Walker suggested. There are some things I would like to discuss with you. Tony nodded before turning his attention back to Peter. Hey, kiddo, I need to step out into the hall with Ms. Walker here, but I'm going to be right back, okay? Okay, Peter replied quietly. Tony patted him on the knee before standing up and out into the hallway, with the social worker closing the door, leaving Peter alone to the silence in the room. Tony made sure to stand near the little window on the door to keep an eye on Peter. He hated the idea of leaving him alone, but the social worker probably figured it would be easier to not let Peter to listen to it, which was understandable considering what he just went through. So, what happened? Tony finally asked. What's going on? Well, like Peter said over the phone, Mrs. Walker began. He and his aunt were in a car accident this evening. Apparently, they had a green light in an intersection, and another driver ran through a red light and crashed into them. Mrs. Parker passed away during surgery. Jesus, Tony muttered, shaking his head. He could imagine May and Peter sitting in that car together, thinking that they were just going home after seeing a movie, and the night took a turn for the worst in a split second. It painfully reminded him of the night his parents died, how they were going to go away for the holiday, only to meet their horrible fate at the hands of. Tony clenched his fists at the mere thought of that man. And Peter told me that May Parker was his last living relative, the social worker continued. So, I must ask, what exactly is your relationship with him? I'm his mentor, Tony said, looking Peter in the room quickly before turning back to Mrs. Walker. He did an internship for me a while back, and we've been keeping in touch since then. It wasn't a complete lie. Other than the whole ordeal regarding Peter being Spider-Man, he and Peter had been spending time together, getting to know one another, and getting into some crazy adventures ever since the Vulture incident. However, he could still tell the social worker found it somewhat odd that a billionaire like himself would bother Tone teenager. Then again, she hadn't gotten to know Peter yet. So, what exactly happens now? Well, given that he's a minor and does not have any next of kin or a legal guardian as far as we know, he will need to be placed in a foster home. Tony didn't even bother to let her finish that thought. Actually, I wasn't asking about that, he said, crossing his arms. I was asking what happens in the process to become his legal guardian. For a brief moment, Mrs. Walker stared at him with widened eyes, clearly not expecting the Tony Stark to ask about becoming the guardian of a minor he met months ago through an internship. However, she managed to recover from the shock with a smile. Mr. Stark, I understand you know the child, she began, but I already have some families who would love to. No, you don't understand, Tony quickly replied, trying to keep his emotions in check. He needed to remain calm for Peter, especially after the night he had. His aunt, a few months ago, he took the envelope out of his pocket, presenting it to her. May Parker changed her will, so that I would be named as Peter's legal guardian if anything were to happen. Mrs. Walker eyed the veteran superhero as she took the papers from him and unfolded them, reading it closely. She was able to see that it was in fact a copy of May's will and turned to the page that stated that the care of Peter Parker would be left to Tony Stark in the event that May was no longer able to provide for her nephew. It felt like an eternity before she finally looked back up at Tony. I see, she simply said before continuing, and do you know of anyone who can verify this and act as an executor? I can't just simply hand Peter over to you. My fiancé is calling our lawyer and May's lawyer as we speak, Tony replied, using all of his strength to remain calm and not make any jokes. They all witnessed us signing the will and can verify it and answer any questions you might have. Peter needs someone he's familiar with, someone he could trust. He doesn't need to go into the system. I can take him home with me tonight, and my fiancé and I will gladly meet with you and the lawyers tomorrow to sign any paperwork that needs to be signed. Mrs. Walker crossed her arms and bit her lip in contemplation. Usually, these situations ended with the child going with her to CPS. It never ended with the child in question calling a billionaire, for whom he did an internship a while ago, and said billionaire claiming that the child's aunt named him as a guardian. Why would Tony Stark be here if this child didn't mean something to him? Please, Tony whispered. He could feel his heart pounding. For someone who was used to making things happen, the veteran superhero had never felt more nervous and helpless. He wanted more than anything to be able to fulfill May's dying wish and to take her orphaned nephew home. But if this social worker refused to comply, the thought of failing May and Peter, on top of the thought of possibly never seeing Peter again, after everything they had been through, done and seen together, made Tony sick to his stomach. Mrs. Walker gave him a small smile. Very well, she finally replied. Tomorrow at 8 a.m. We can meet at CPS, and if all goes well, you can be granted temporary guardianship until a court hearing can be scheduled. Absolutely, Tony replied with a huge smile on his face. We'll be there. Relief coursed through his body. And not for nothing, but I do think the fact that he thought to call you speaks volumes of how much he trusts you, she said. We can talk to his doctor and get his release papers signed, and then you'll be free to take him for the night. Hopefully, for longer than that after tomorrow, Tony thought to himself. Perfect, Tony said quickly, and you have my word. You will see us in your office tomorrow. Good, Mrs. Walker took out a small card, and here is my card with all my contact info and the address to the office. If you need anything before tomorrow, you can reach out. Much appreciated, Tony replied as he took the card from her. He used one of his famous Tony Stark smiles. I can tell you really care about your job and these kids. It's what I do, Mr. Stark, she replied with a small smile. Now, shall we get back to Peter? Absolutely, Tony replied. He wasted no time in opening the door to walk back in with the social worker following him inside. Hey, buddy, I told you I'd be back. Peter looked at Tony and the social worker as if he was trying to figure out just what they were talking about. So, he tried to say before Tony sat in the chair across from him. "I know what you're going to ask," Tony said, holding a hand up to stop Peter, "and I promise, we'll talk more about that tomorrow. Right now, we're just going to talk to the doctor, sign some papers, and get you all set, and then we'll head home. You need some sleep." Peter didn't even bother to question as to whether Tony was talking about the apartment or his penthouse in the Avengers Tower. He could only nod, accepting that he and Tony would talk tomorrow. "Okay," Peter finally said. "Thanks, Mr. Stark." "You bet, kid." Chapter 4. It honestly felt like an eternity listening to Dr. Bailey and Dr. Becker talk to Tony and the social worker. For some reason, they stayed in the same room they put May in, but Peter couldn't bring himself to mind it because it was going to be painful when they would eventually have to leave. Peter watched his mentor sign his release papers before he handed them back to the doctor and took the prescription for Peter's pain medication. After a few more minutes, Tony shook hands and thanked the doctors and the social worker before they turned to Peter, giving him their condolences, and Peter managed to snap out of his fog long enough to thank them before they finally left him and Tony alone with May, as the social worker mentioned something about a meeting tomorrow. As soon as they were alone, Tony turned to Peter, crouching down next to him, clutching his arm. "Whenever you're ready, kid," he said quietly. "You call the shots here." "I feel like leaving will just," Peter replied, looking at his aunt's still body, "make it more real." Tony sighed as he rubbed Peter's arm. "I know, buddy," he said, "but you take as long as you need, okay?" The rookie superhero nodded as he kept his eyes on May. A part of him wanted to wait and see if maybe she would suddenly wake up and take him home, but the logical part of him knew that wasn't going to happen. She was gone. She was dead and never going to come back. Tears formed in his eyes again with that thought in his head. As much as he hated crying in front of Tony Stark, he simply bowed his head, letting the tears flow freely down his cheeks. He didn't even try to wipe them away as he reached forward and grabbed May's hand as Tony rubbed his back. "I'm sorry, Aunt May," Peter finally whispered to her. "I'm sorry I couldn't do more to save you. I should have, please forgive me." Tony wanted to stop him right there to tell him that it wasn't his fault. He knew that even before the social worker told him what happened in the accident, but he decided to let Peter finish. These were his last moments with his aunt, the woman who raised him all those years, and he couldn't ruin that for Peter right now. "I love you so much, May," Peter finally spoke up after a moment. "I wish you didn't leave me so soon, but I know you're with Uncle Ben, and Mom, and Dad. I love you, Aunt May, and I promise, I'll never forget you, never. I'm going to miss you so much." He leaned forward without any second thought and kissed her forehead. "I love you, May." After another moment of silence, he finally leaned back to face Tony. "Okay, I am ready," he said with tears. Tony nodded and stood up, helping Peter to his feet. As soon as his mentee was on his feet, he wrapped an arm around him as he took one last look at May, mentally promising her, if she could hear it, to take care of her nephew. With that, he slowly guided Peter out of the room. He could tell that the doctor wanted to move her body to the morgue, and he wasted no time in getting Peter out of the room before he could see it. Tony himself went through that experience alone when his parents died, and he did not wish for Peter to go through the same thing. He moved with Peter by his side quickly through the hallway all the way to the elevator. The rookie superhero was clearly not in the mindset to ask any questions or to engage in conversation, and Tony didn't dare force him. He remembered being the same way with Obadiah when his parents died all those years ago. "Happy's waiting for us in the car," Tony whispered to Peter once they were alone in an elevator. "We'll go back to your place and grab a few things, okay? And then we'll head back to the tower?" Peter could only nod in reply, which Tony expected. The billionaire rubbed his arm, holding him close by his side. For once, he didn't know what else to say, but he couldn't help but feel that maybe the silence was enough for the time being. He didn't try to reassure Peter at this moment. How could he? The kid's aunt, his last living relative, was suddenly taken away from him in the span of a few hours, and now, he was suddenly placed under someone else's responsibility. Granted, Peter didn't know that yet, but Tony prayed that Peter would be able to handle the news when they were to talk tomorrow morning. The billionaire refused to think about it now. That was for tomorrow. For now, he needed to get Peter to the car and to get the bare essentials for him to take back to the tower. It felt like an eternity before the elevator doors opened on the main floor of the hospital. "Come on, kid," Tony whispered to Peter, keeping him close. "Happy's right out front." "Okay, Mr. Stark," Peter replied with little emotion in his voice. Peter felt as if he was watching himself going through the motions. He wasn't sure whether or not he was going to pass out on Tony, and he couldn't bring himself to care. He could only watch his feet move next to Tony's until he suddenly realized that they finally made it outside, and sure enough, there was a flashy Audi right outside the building. Tony then quickly grabbed the door, opening it and gently ushering Peter inside before following him inside. The billionaire and the teenager saw Happy looking at him in the rearview mirror. However, the head of security didn't dare say anything to Peter, but Peter could see that he was silently offering his condolences. Although he appreciated it, he couldn't bring himself other than nod his head. "Where to, boss?" Happy asked. "Take us to the apartment, Hap," Tony replied, wrapping an arm around Peter, holding him close. "We got to grab some of Peter's things." Happy nodded and wasted no time in turning the car back on and driving away from the hospital. Peter could only stare off into space. His eyes were burning and puffy from how much he cried, and his body felt as if it was 100 pounds and shaking. The low rumble of the car moving was somehow able to relax him somehow as he slowly sat back in the seat. He briefly acknowledged that the clock in the car read 2:30 a.m. He and May got into that car accident around 11:30 and midnight, but to Peter, it felt longer than that. The teen's eyelids grew heavier as he leaned back against the seat and slowly slid to the right, and immediately, out of the corner of his eye, he saw Tony's knee and jolted back up. Sorry, Mr. Stark," he said meekly. "Kid, come on," Tony said, moving his arm up, extending it. "We've known each other for almost a year now. I think that warrants you being able to catch home shut eye on me. Come on, I don't bite." The teen wanted to chuckle and refuse, to try his hardest to stay upright and awake, but sleep kept pulling at him, calling him. His tired body's needs outweighed his need to maintain a sense of pride, and with that in mind, he slowly inched toward Tony until he was leaning against the billionaire's side as said billionaire loosely wrapped an arm around the kid's shoulders. "Get some sleep, Pete," Tony whispered. "I'll wake you up when we get to the apartment." Peter nodded and slowly allowed sleep to overtake him. Next thing he knew, Peter found himself in the elevator going up to his apartment with Tony beside him. When they arrived, Tony had initially offered to have Happy go grab his things, but he politely refused, insisting that he knew where everything was in his room. However, he did ask Tony to come up with him, silently telling his mentor that he didn't want to go up to the apartment alone, and thankfully, Tony didn't make him say it aloud. So, the mentor and mentee made their way through the hallway. It was late at night, so people were asleep and weren't around to question why Tony Stark was in the hallway going to an apartment with Peter Parker in the wee hours of the morning. Yes, Tony visited Peter and May a few times, but it was during reasonable hours and when May was around. As soon as Peter and Tony finally got to the door to the Parker apartment, Peter didn't say anything as he took out his keys and unlocked the door. He wasn't sure what he expected when he walked into the apartment, but he saw it empty. A part of him was expecting May to come out of her room ready to lecture him for walking in so late, but then he remembered, she wasn't going to be here. She was never going to be. May was gone, dead. Tears came to his eyes again at that thought, and the pain opened up that void in his heart even more. He wasn't sure exactly what was going to happen to him now, but he couldn't bring himself to care about that, at least not now. All he knew was that he probably wasn't coming back to this apartment for a while, and May wasn't either. "You can just pack a few things for tonight and tomorrow, kid," Tony said, jolting him out of his thoughts. "We'll worry about everything else later." Peter didn't dare to reply, afraid that he would burst out crying. Without saying another word, he walked into his room, closing the door behind him, and as soon as he closed the door, the teen plopped on his bed face first in his pillow, sobbing. His aunt was gone for a few hours, after they had just gone out for a movie night, and his life was already turning upside down. It was bad enough that he had to now live with the fact that he just lost another relative, who had been there for him through thick and thin, but he had no clue what Tony planned to do with him. Was he going to pull him out of school and make him work? Was he going to ship him off somewhere? Was he going to just send him into the system after all? However, the small logical part of him made him realize that Tony wouldn't have offered to take him home if that was the case, but then again, who could say for sure? With that thought, he let out another sob. Little did he know that Tony actually perked at the sound of his sobs from the living room, and he slowly walked over to the door he saw the teen walk through and close behind him. He didn't dare to follow Peter, afraid of possibly overwhelming the kid, but the minute he heard the boy crying, he stood up from the couch and came up to the door. His hand went to the doorknob but stopped in midair. He had told Peter that they had known each other and had gotten closer over the last 10 months, and they had gone through a lot together. However, none of that ever prepared Tony for somehow comforting this teen he took under his wing when he had just lost a loved one. What could he possibly say, or do? His mentee lost his aunt. What was there to say? Would Peter accept whatever he tried to do to help him or turn him away? Tony sighed in frustration and ran a hand through his hair. This is ridiculous, he thought to himself. He was Tony Stark, Iron Man, comforting a teenager he knew should have come easy to him, especially someone like Peter Parker when they knew each other as long as they did. He flew a missile into a wormhole above New York. He faced Ultron with the other Avengers. This situation was simple on a much larger scale. Still, he took a deep breath and knocked on the door. Pete? Peter immediately stopped sobbing when he heard his mentor on the other side of the door. Pete, can I come in? Peter said as he quickly sat up, wiping the tears off his face. Why yeah, Mr. Stark, come in. He quickly grabbed a suitcase from under his bed, and he noted the BFP engraved on the blue suitcase as Tony opened the door and walked in. Sorry, I'm packing. I'm just trying to figure out what I need, Kid, Tony said, cutting him off as he sat down next to his protege on the bed. I heard you crying in here. Peter was about to respond but stopped before he could say anything else as a blush crept onto his face. He hadn't meant for Tony to hear him crying. I am sorry, he said quietly. You don't have anything to be sorry about, Tony said as he placed a hand on Peter's back, rubbing it. You've had a long day, and you're upset, exhausted. All of the above, Peter interjected. Plus, I have no idea what you plan to do with me, he added mentally. Listen, Pete, Tony finally said after a moment of silence, if you want, I can pack your stuff for you. You can just tell me what you need. Peter sighed as much as he would love to just let someone else do the packing for him. He hated the idea of coming across as this helpless little kid in front of Tony. He had to push down the grief and save it for later, for a different time. No, it's okay really, he finally said. I can do it, but, can you sit in here with me? Maybe if he had Tony in the room with him, then Peter could focus on getting his things together. Tony clearly thought the same and nodded. With that, Peter fished out some clothes from his dresser and closet. He wasn't sure how long he was going to stay with Tony, so he packed enough necessities for at least a few days. Tony didn't say anything, which meant he was keeping his word as to them saving the talking for the morning, and Peter didn't bother to ask. Here you go, kid, Tony said as he opened the door to the guest room, allowing Peter to walk in with his suitcase. He, Peter, and Happy had just returned to the penthouse on the top floor of Avengers Tower, and Tony immediately guided Peter to the guest room. This was not new to either Peter or Tony. Peter had stayed over for a few weekends with Tony whenever May went away, and he stayed in the guest room. However, with that very thought, Peter came to that same realization that was repeating again and again ever since the hospital. May wasn't coming back from a trip, she was dead, and never coming back, and Peter had no idea how long he was going to be staying with Tony. However, for the time being, as soon as Peter laid his eyes on the queen-sized bed in the room, he wanted nothing more than to get some sleep. He even could see that it was 3:30 a.m. on the digital clock on the nightstand. Thanks, Mr. Stark, Peter said, turning to the billionaire. Tony smiled somewhat and wrapped an arm around Peter. Get some sleep, kid, he said gently. We'll talk in the morning when I come back from the meeting, okay? Okay, Peter replied, nodding. And if you need anything during the night, Tony added, you know the drill. Have Friday get me. Peter gave another small smile to the billionaire. Noted, Mr. Stark, he said. They wished each other good night, and Tony left his mentee alone to go to bed himself. Peter wasted no time in putting his pajamas on and getting ready to sleep in the big, comfy bed. The weight of his grief ached throughout his body as he constantly reminded himself that May was gone, for good, but he ran out of tears to cry for the night and just wanted to sleep, even though doing so would make this nightmare all the more real. The teen superhero climbed into his bed and let sleep immediately take over, subduing his doubt and grief running through his body. Chapter 5. Tony only slept for a few hours that night, but he felt far from rested. He could feel his heart pounding as Happy drove him and Pepper closer to Child Protection Services. He looked down at his phone and saw no texts from a certain teenager. That brought some relief for the billionaire, as he realized that it was likely that Peter was still asleep. "How was he last night?" Pepper asked, jolting Tony out of his thoughts. Tony sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Upset, shocked, all of the above," he replied. "He slept through the night fine, but he's going to be in for a shock when he wakes up if this meeting goes well." Pepper gently wrapped an arm around Tony's shoulders and kissed him on the cheek. "Tony, if you don't want to do this," she said, "it's okay. We can look into other options for P." No, I'm doing this, Pep," he interjected. "I mean, I know I'm not exactly the right guy to take care of a kid, but I owe it to May, to Peter. He needs someone he can trust, someone who can be there for him, someone who knows him, and what he's going through," and he grabbed his left wrist, lightly rubbing it. The idea of Peter going into the system, after knowing him for this long, I don't know, You would miss him, Pepper said for him as she lightly gripped Tony's hands to calm him down with her free one. Tony nodded. As painful as it was, he had to admit that Pepper was right. He would miss Peter. The idea of not seeing Peter again, and no more lab days, patrol nights, missions, somehow made his stomach churn and his left arm numb. Peter and Tony had become involved in each other's lives in less than a year, and right now, Peter needed that. "It's more than just what May wanted," Pepper continued. "You would miss him." Tony sighed and shook his head. "As always," he said quietly, "you're right." "Of course, I am," Pepper said, smiling. "I've seen the two of you together, and I know you two will get this figured out and that I will help whenever I can every step of the way." "Thanks, Pep," Tony replied before kissing his fiancée on the lips. "I love you." "I love you, too," Pepper replied softly. "Hey, guys," Happy suddenly said, interrupting the couple, "we're here." Pepper and Tony looked to see that they had arrived to CPS, and Happy was pulling into a parking spot in front of the building. The veteran superhero took a deep breath. "Well, it's now or never," he whispered. The veteran superhero and the CEO of Stark Industries both got off the elevator as soon as the doors opened. Sure enough, when they stepped off, Pepper and Tony found their lawyer, May's lawyer, and Mrs. Walker the social worker all standing in the waiting room, which was thankfully completely empty. It took everything Tony had to fight the urge to make a sarcastic comment. He couldn't do that now, not when he was about to be named as the legal guardian of a teenager. One slip of the tongue could send Peter into the system, no matter what May's will said, and he refused to let that happen. Instead, he gave one of his world-famous smiles. "Mr. Stark, Miss Potts, Larry," Tony and Pepper's lawyer, said as he shook hands with each of them. Larry was a man in his late 50s with jet black hair and glasses. "Good morning, Larry," Tony replied with a small smile on his face. "I trust that you remember Michael," Larry gestured to another gentleman standing next to him. It didn't take Pepper and Tony long to recognize May's lawyer. The man had salt and pepper hair and was clearly in his 60s. "It's good to see you both again," Michael said. "Larry and Mrs. Walker briefed me on what happened last night. First of all, please extend my condolences to Peter. This must be quite a difficult time for him." "Difficult doesn't even begin to cover it," Tony thought to himself. "Of course, thank you," Pepper said with diplomacy and tact in her voice. "Peter will appreciate that." Michael nodded. Tony remembered meeting May's lawyer when she named him as Peter's backup guardian a few months ago, and it was only now, just a day after May's untimely death, that he realized that this man was all too familiar with the tragedies that had occurred in the 15 years of Peter Parker's life, his parents dying, his uncle Ben, May's husband, dying, and now, his aunt dying. He was jolted out of his thoughts when he saw Mrs. Walker standing in front of him. "Oh, sorry," Tony suddenly said. Pepper, this is Danielle Walker, Peter's social worker." "Mrs. Walker, this is my fiancée, Pepper Potts." "Very nice to meet you, Miss Potts," Mrs. Walker said as she extended her hand to Pepper. "You as well, Mrs. Walker," Pepper said. "I hope we can get this all cleared up quickly for Peter's sake." "Indeed, shall we get started?" Mrs. Walker said, leading the four of them down a narrow hallway to a conference room. Tony was the last one to walk in as he stopped at the threshold of the room, checking his phone once more. There was no text from Peter or an alert from Friday, which meant that his mentee was probably still sleeping at the penthouse. Once he was sure that Peter wasn't going to need him, he took a deep breath and walked in, sitting next to Pepper and Larry. "This meeting is being recorded for legal purposes," Michael began as he placed his phone at the center of the table. "We are here to discuss the will of May Parker, who passed away unexpectedly last night on June 16, 2017, and the custody of her nephew by marriage, Peter Benjamin Parker." Tony took a deep breath as everyone went around the table introducing themselves. The meeting lasted an hour and a half, and it was fairly easy. Larry believed it was because Tony was named as Peter's guardian in the will, and Tony was grateful. The easier this was for Peter, the better. Although, that still left him with the hardest part. Telling Peter about the meeting, and to say that the billionaire was nervous would be an understatement. Pepper wasn't kidding when she said that things would be different. It definitely would be, for both of them. He was now in charge of a teenager, and not just a teenager, an enhanced teenager, and Peter was going to have to live with someone else and adjust to a lifestyle he wasn't that familiar with. Sure, he had stayed with Tony before, but it was only for a few weekends over the course of 10 months. His left hand began to tremble, but he quickly grabbed it with his right, trying to hold it steady again. However, Pepper quickly placed her hand on his, relaxing him somewhat as they rode back to the tower with Happy in the driver's seat. "It's okay to be nervous," Pepper said gently, "but I don't think Peter will get mad over this. He's a good kid, and he's always appreciative of what you've done for him." "He won't be happy about this, Pep," Tony said, holding her hand tightly. "His aunt died just last night, and now, I'm coming in with this bomb. I feel like I'm ripping the rug out from under him." "No, I'm sure this will be a big adjustment," Pepper said, "but he's also smart enough to know that you're doing this to help him, and that you care about him. And if you want, I can talk to him for you." "No," Tony replied. "I should do it. It would mean more coming from me. I'll call you if I need backup though." Pepper rolled her eyes. "He's teenager," she retorted, "not an alien." "Exactly." Peter opened his eyes slowly as he roused from his deep sleep and looked around, taking in his surroundings. It took him a moment to realize that he wasn't in his bedroom on 15th Street in Queens. He was in the guest room at the Avengers Tower in Manhattan. He briefly wondered if he was staying with Tony while May was away, but that was when he remembered. All the pain, the heaviness, came rushing back. He and May went to see a movie last night, and they got into a car accident. May didn't make it. She was dead, and Tony Stark came to the hospital and got him out of possibly going into the system. His head immediately began pounding, and he brought his hand up to his head, feeling the gauze. He forgot the mild concussy at the moment, not when his aunt, his last living relative, was dead. Tears formed in his eyes as he closed them, allowing them to stream down his cheeks. "Aunt May," he whispered, sniffling. "Please let this be a bad dream." He sniffled again as he turned over and sobbed into his pillows. "Please." "Well, time to face the music," Tony said as they stepped into the elevator in the parking garage. "Let me know if you need me to come up and help," Pepper said as the elevator started moving, "or let me know that it went well, which it will, once you're done." "Of course," Tony said as he gave her a kiss on the cheek. "I'll talk to you later." As soon as he said that, the elevator opened to Stark Industries. "Okay, I love you," Pepper replied as she stepped off, leaving Tony alone. "Love you too." With one last smile at Pepper, the elevator doors closed as it continued its journey to the penthouse. "Friday, is Peter awake?" Tony asked his AI. "Affirmative, boss," Friday replied. "Peter woke up about 15 minutes ago. He appears to be in emotional distress." Hearing that last statement broke Tony's heart, and it made him feel somewhat guilty for not being there when Peter woke up. Although, he wasn't awake for too long, which made the billionaire feel somewhat better. "I sort of expected that," Tony said as he looked at the manila envelope in his hands. Next thing he knew, the elevator doors opened, and Tony walked into the penthouse. The veteran superhero wasted no time in sprinting to Peter's room. He stopped short and gently knocked so as to not startle the kid. "Pete, it's me," he said. "Can I come in?" "Sure," Peter replied. His voice sounded muffled. Tony immediately opened the door and allowed his face to fall when he saw what was in front of him. There was Peter curled up in the bed and his face in the pillows. "Hey, Underoos," Tony said gently as he walked in and sat down on the bed at Peter's hip. "Sleep well?" With his face still up against the pillow, Peter nodded. "I guess," he replied. Tony sighed, somewhat grateful that Peter was able to get through the night. He slowly placed his hand on Peter's back. "Friday said you just woke up," he said. He honestly wasn't sure how he wanted this conversation to go where it needed to go. However, the small talk might help. "Yeah," Peter mumbled, nodding. He slightly turned his head so that he could look at Tony, allowing the latter to see his bloodshot eyes and pale face. His eyebrows furrowed together. "I'm a little fuzzy right now, sorry, but didn't you have a meeting or something?" He would have sat up, but he didn't want to risk losing Tony's hand on his back. It kept him grounded for the moment. "I did," Tony replied. "I just got back with Pepper." "Oh, Miss Potts is here?" Peter asked. "She's working downstairs," Tony said quickly, rubbing the kid's back. "It's just you and me here, which is good because I need to talk to you about some things." Peter propped himself up on his elbow as he looked at Tony, feeling his heart beginning to pound. Was this it already? Was Tony going to send him into the system after all? What kind of things? He asked. "Why don't you freshen up real quick?" Tony suggested. "We can talk more in the living room, okay?" "Okay," Peter replied meekly. He silently got out of bed as Tony left him alone to give him privacy. Peter brushed his teeth and washed his face before meeting Tony in the living room. He didn't bother to change out of his pajamas, and he was somewhat relieved when he only saw Tony sitting on the couch. No sign of the social worker. So far, so good. "Come here, kid," Tony said, patting a spot on the couch next to him, and it was then that he noticed a manila envelope sitting on the coffee table. "For starters," Tony said as he picked up the envelope and held it out to Peter, "I want to see these." Peter furrowed his eyebrows together in confusion as he took the envelope and opened it, taking the papers out and reading the first page. As he read it, Peter's jaw dropped, and his eyes widened. "So, why you're my legal guardian now?" he asked aloud. This wasn't what he expected, at all. Tony nodded. So far, so good. It sounded like he was more shocked and not angry. "Well, not officially yet," he began. "We would have to go to family court for a hearing so the judge can approve." The teenager looked at Tony, trying to see if this was possibly a cruel joke, but when he saw that the billionaire wasn't laughing or showing any signs, his eyes widened as he turned his sights back to the paperwork in his hands. Tony was actually being serious. He was now Peter's legal guardian. Tony was now going to keep him here and take care of him, just as May and Ben had done, but that would mean that he would have to change things, be responsible for another human being. It wasn't that Peter didn't think he could do it, but maybe Tony felt like he had no choice, like he was obligated to take in this kid, who was his intern. What if Tony eventually decided to back out? "Mr. Stark, why you don't have to do this," he finally said. "I mean, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but it's what your aunt wanted, kid," Tony interjected gently, "and quite frankly, I'm not too fond of the idea of you going into the system and—" "What she wanted?" Peter suddenly asked as he turned back to Tony. He didn't miss when Tony essentially answered his question as to whether or not he was going into the system, but he was more focused on Tony's statement that this was what May wanted. "You didn't know this at the time," Tony began, "but a few months ago, she and I met with our lawyers and changed her will so that, if anything were to happen, then you would stay with me." Really? You guys never told me." "Well, she didn't want to worry you. I guess we just never guessed that the day would actually come." Peter stared at Tony and nodded. He didn't doubt any word of what Tony said, especially when he said that May didn't want him to worry about naming the billionaire as a guardian should anything happen to her. Of course, she wouldn't want him to worry about anything happening to her if she suddenly changed her will, but he also understood why she would change it in the first place. Peter had no other relatives, and she had seen how much he and Tony trusted each other and cared about each other. That clearly would have been enough for her to name the billionaire as a guardian for him. "They both care very deeply about you." The teen closed his eyes as her words flashed in his mind. It had only been a day, and somehow, their last conversation felt like a lifetime ago. When Peter didn't say anything else, Tony decided to take a leap and continue the conversation. "And I spoke to the social worker, Pepper, and the lawyers about all this," he began, "so we're all set there. The only thing is the social worker, Mrs. Walker, wants to meet with us once a month for a bit just to, check in and see how things are going." "Why?" Peter asked, furrowing his eyebrows together. "Well, I'm not exactly the type of person someone would trust to take care of a kid, so—" If Peter wasn't so stricken with the heavy weight of grief, He would have protested Tony's statement. He wasn't stupid. He knew about Tony's playboy past and his drinking problems. It was on the news for as long as he could remember, but Tony had changed over the years, especially after they first met. In the time they had known each other, Peter saw his stable, healthy relationship with Pepper Potts and never once saw Tony pick up a drink. Why was it so hard for people to see how he changed? So, she's basically checking up on us to see if I need to go into the system. Which we won't let happen. Peter stared at Tony, taking in the firmness in his voice when he said that. Promise. Promise, kid, Tony said before sighing. Look, I'm going to be honest with you here. This is new territory for me, for both of us, and with what you just went through, I get it. After my parents died, he tried to findle like everything was turned upside down and inside out. Peter scoffed. Understatement of the millennium, he muttered. My point is, he tried to refocus the teen. You're not alone, Pete. It's going to be a big adjustment for you. For me, he added mentally. I'm going to be there for you every step of the way, just as I have been these past 10 months. It's not going to be easy, but we're going to learn along the way and work together. We're going to be the team that we've been and get through this. Tears formed in his brown eyes. Thank you, Mr. Stark, Peter said. He's saying this now, Peter thought to himself, but what's going to happen when I piss him off over something or he decides he can't do this anymore? He never doubted May's unconditional love, but with Tony, what if he found that he would much rather prefer coming to visit than becoming a guardian full-time? But really, he continued, if you ever get sick of me. Nah, never going to happen. Tony interjected firmly. Trust me, kid, this is what your aunt wants, and it's what I want. Remember what I told you when I gave you my number to keep in touch with me? If I didn't want to offer, I wouldn't have, and that's the same thing with this. If I didn't want you here, it wouldn't have happened, got it? Peter nodded. He tried to thank Tony, but words were suddenly lost on him as tears suddenly fell instead as the overwhelming grief over his aunt's death, the appreciation for Tony taking him in now, and all other mixed emotions that had taken over since last night suddenly smacked him in the face. He turned away trying to avoid crying in front of Tony Stark. I'm sorry, he tried to say before succumbing to his tears. Hey, Tony said as he wrapped an arm around the teen holding him close to his side, allowing Peter to lean against his shoulder just as he had done before. It's okay, buddy. There's no reason to be sorry. Peter tried to answer but couldn't get the words out. All he could do was just cry at the moment. Tony clearly sensed this and gently shushed the teen. Just let it all out, kid, he whispered, gently rubbing his shoulder. It broke his heart to see his mentee crying like this, out of grief. I miss her so much, Peter said in between sobs. It had only been a day since the accident, and he already missed his aunt like crazy. Knowing that he was never going to see her again, that they would never get to go to the movies together anymore, that she would never get to hug him or kiss him on the forehead, that he just lost his last living relative, made his heart ache so badly. Tony didn't say anything as he closed his eyes trying to figure out what else he could say or do, but the truth was, there weren't any words or actions that could fix May's untimely death. He knew that better than anyone. He didn't have much of a relationship with his father, but knowing that he missed out on the chance to tell Howard how much he loved him, that guilt would never leave him. Missing his mother made his heart ache for her, and to add insult to injury, his pain was increased tenfold when he learned the truth about his parents' deaths in Siberia, from a Hydra agent. The old wounds reopened tenfold, and he had to grieve the losses all over again. It wasn't a walk in the park. I know, kid, Tony said as he gently rubbed Peter's shoulder. Oh God, I'm so sorry. Peter continued to sob as he turned around to bury his face in his shoulder. This all feels like a crazy dream, he said. He succumbed to his tears yet again. I know, kid, Tony whispered again. What else could he possibly say? Peter's last living relative was dead. There was nothing that could undo what had happened. God, I don't know what else to say. It's a shitty situation, but, kid, I promise, you'll get through this. I'll get you through this. Somehow, someway, we'll get through this, together. Peter nodded, not trusting himself to speak without bursting out crying. He trusted Tony implicitly, and he knew that Tony would hardly lie to him, especially now. He slowly brought his hand up and lightly grasped Tony's shirt, and he stiffened when Tony placed his hand on his, thinking he was going to push it away and saying that he was crossing a boundary. Instead, he just rested his hand on top of his, keeping it in place. Do you have any questions, Pete? Tony asked after a moment of silence. Is there, anything you don't get right now? Peter was about to say no, but he stopped. Tony explained that he was now his legal guardian, but there was one thing they forgot to cover. What about? He began pulling away to make eye contact with the billionaire. What about May's funeral? Do you want me to? He couldn't finish that question. Don't worry, buddy, Tony replied, rubbing Peter's back. Pepper and I will take care of it. You can help if you're up to it, but I'm not putting you under that pressure. Are you sure? Positive. Okay, thanks, Mr. Stark. You're welcome. Now, Tony stood up. You need to eat something. How about some breakfast? Peter nodded. Now that he was thinking about it, he was pretty hungry. Do you mind if I call my friend, Ned, real quick? He asked. I should let him know what's going on. Sure, bud, Tony said. I'll call you when it's ready. Chapter 6. Peter closed the door behind him, leaving it open ajar, not wanting Tony to think that he didn't trust him. He grabbed his phone and looked for Ned's number, and as soon as he saw it, he tapped it and brought it to his ear, listening to it ring. Hey, man, what's up? Ned finally said after 2 rings. I got to talk to you. You got a sec? Peter asked, worried that he might have interrupted something or woken him up. Of course, don't forget. I'm your guy in the chair, Ned replied. Peter chuckled. Between Tony's comfort and consolation in Ned's humor, he could face a sense of grounding in the tragedy, and he welcomed it with open arms. Well, Ned, he finally tried to say. Tears began to form again as he took a shaky breath. Ned must have sensed it. Peter, are you okay? What's wrong? Peter took a deep breath, trying to find the words. How was he supposed to tell his best friend that his aunt was dead? Something happened last night. May and we went to the movies last night. He took a deep breath as tears streamed down his face, and Ned didn't say anything, giving him a chance to continue. However, Peter could tell that he was getting anxious. We got in an accident last night. Some guy rammed into us from the side. Shit, are you guys okay? Where are you now? Are you and May at the hospital? What? Ned, slow down, Peter quickly said. I'm okay, but May, he couldn't bring himself to say it, but he knew he had to. Ned, May didn't make it. Holy shit, Peter, dude, Ned replied. I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. There was a moment of silence as Ned sighed. Wait, where are you right now? Are you at the hospital? Do you need my mom to pick you up? Peter said, trying his hardest to not break down sobbing. Actually, I'm at the Avengers Tower. I was at the hospital last night, and a social worker tried to take me. But I didn't want to leave her, and she let me call someone. I called Mr. Stark, and he picked me up. Wait, are you serious? Ned asked. You're with Tony Stark? Peter chuckled again. Yeah, dude, I want to say it's awesome, Ned replied, but given what happened, you know what I mean. Peter laughed yet again through his tears and sniffed. Don't worry, man, he replied. I know what you meant, but, that's not all. Mr. Stark and I were just talking, and he told me that he's my legal guardian now. Double holy shit, Ned said quickly. Iron Man took you in? Yeah, he told me that May named him as my guardian in her will, in case, you know. Well, that's great, not great, but you don't have to go, into the system. That's amazing he took you in. Yeah, it is, don't get me wrong. Ned, being the best friend and guy in the chair he was, sensed the sadness and nervousness in his voice. What's wrong, Peter? He knew exactly what it was, but he wanted to hear Peter say it, to not hide it. I am glad Mr. Stark took me in, Ned, and he said that this is what both he and May wanted. It's just, I don't want Mr. Stark to feel like he has to do this, or regret it, Ned sighed. Peter, he began, look, you and Mr. Stark have been buddy-buddy for a while now. If he didn't want to take you in, he wouldn't have. Hell, he wouldn't have agreed to be your guardian. He probably would have told May to forget it, and there's no way she could do it without him knowing about it. Peter quickly realized that Ned had a point. A will was a legal document, and May wouldn't have made Tony his guardian without him agreeing to it. It sounded like it didn't work that way. Not only that, but Tony had said so himself. If he didn't want Peter, he wouldn't have gone through with this. "I guess you're right," he finally said. "Of course, I am," Ned said, "and trust me, May had to have known what she was doing when she picked him." Peter smiled sadly at the mention of his aunt. "Yeah, that's true," he finally said. "She always knew what to do." "It's going to be okay, Peter," Ned said. Is it okay if I tell my mom? She's going to want to know all the details." Why yeah, Peter replied. "I'll let you know what the plan is. Mr. Stark is going to take care of all that." "Okay, keep me posted," Ned said. "Do you want me to tell MJ?" "No, that's okay," Peter replied. "I can call her later today." "Hey, Pete," Tony called from the kitchen. "Food's ready." "Coming," Peter called back. "I gotta go. I'll text you later." "Yeah, definitely," Ned replied. "Call me if you need anything." "Thanks, man," Peter said, smiling a little. "Talk to you later." "Okay, bye," Ned said. "Bye." Peter then hung up the phone before walking out to join Tony for breakfast. As he came back into the living room, he saw Tony in the kitchen on the phone himself as he placed 2 plates of food on the counter. "Yeah, I'm going to see if he's up to it," he heard Tony say on the phone. "I haven't heard anything from the hospital yet, but as soon as I know something, we can make the arrangements." He paused as Peter walked over following the scent. "Yeah, I'll keep you posted." "Okay. Love you too, bye." "Pepper?" Peter asked as he sat down in front of a plate of pancakes, bacon, and hash browns. "Yeah," Tony said, pouring some juice into 2 glasses for him and Peter. "She just wanted to check in and see how things were going and how you were doing. She said that she'd be back later today to check on you." Peter nodded as he sat down and began to dig into the pancakes and took the juice. "She's okay with me staying here, right?" Tony furrowed his eyebrows together as he sat down next to Peter. "Of course, she is," he replied. "You know her, and she loves you." "I know, but that was when I just came over to stay for a weekend or to work in the lab or to go out to eat. Not to stay here, you know." "Kid, I promise you, it's no trouble at all," Tony replied with a hand on the teen's shoulder. "I want you here, and Pepper wants you here. She's completely on board with this, and even if she wasn't, I would still do it, for your aunt, and for you." Peter smiled as his confidence increased within. Between Tony's reassuring words and Ned's own heartfelt speech, he could easily see that there was truth behind this, that Tony really did want to take him in and to give him a place to stay and to help him through this tragedy. "Thanks, Mr. Stark," he finally said. "Really? You're welcome, kiddo," Tony replied. "Did you have a chance to talk to Ned?" "Yeah," Peter said after swallowing more of his food. "I told him what was going on. His mom is going to want to know the details, so I said I would keep him posted." "Don't worry. Pepper and I will take care of all that. All you would need to do is make sure you tell the people you would want to know, but we're not worrying about that today." "Why's that?" "Because you and I are going to go on a field trip today." "What? Where?" "Upstate." "Upstate? Like, upstate? There was only one place Peter could think of that was upstate, and why Tony would want to go there. He had been there once before when Tony asked him to join the Avengers. "The only upstate there is, kid," Tony replied, leaning back in the chair smiling at Peter's excitement. Peter rolled his eyes in response. "But seriously, you really want me to come?" he asked. "I won't be in the way of anything?" "Peter, you're never in the way," Tony replied gently, "and besides, I'm just going to visit Rhodey and Vision. I need to check on Rhodey, and I would also like Dr. Cho to check on your head just to be on the safe side and to modify your pain meds." Tony wouldn't admit it out loud, but it ached that Bruce had gone missing after the battle with Ultron. He immediately knew that the doctor would have loved Peter, and Peter would have been so excited to meet Dr. Banner himself. Hopefully, one day, Bruce would come back and bring back a little more normalcy, if Northern given the Accords debacle. Peter brought his hand to the gauze wrapped around his head. He had honestly forgotten about the injury on his head from the accident. "Okay," he replied. "Good," Tony replied, "so as soon as we're done eating, you can get dressed, and then we'll head out." "Sounds good, Mr. Stark," Peter said, giving the billionaire a thumbs up. "And that's something we got to work on," Tony quickly added. "Huh?" Peter asked with a mouthful of pancakes. "I've been trying to get you to call me Tony for a few months now," Tony replied, "but now that you're living here, I'm making it mandatory. call me Tony." Peter chuckled and rolled his eyes. The veteran superhero wasn't lying about that one fact. He had been trying to get Peter to call him by his first name for the past few months. The rookie superhero had tried to call his mentor, Tony, but he gave up after the first few tries because it felt way too weird. So, he always stuck with, Mr. Stark. "I can try, Mr. Santa." Fine, I can try, Mr. Santa." Tony. It didn't feel so weird right then, but I can't make any promises. Tony smiled back in pride hearing Peter use his first name. "That's all I ask," he said. As soon as Tony and Peter finished breakfast, cleaned up, and Peter got dressed, the billionaire took his protégé down to the garage littered with Tony's Audis. He led Peter to his orange one, and they both hopped in with Tony in the driver's seat. Happy had offered to drive them, but Pepper and Tony insisted that it would be best for Peter if it were just the two of them. Plus, Pepper and Happy would be able to go back to Peter and May's apartment to grab more of Peter's things. "So, listen, about Monday, I know it's your last day of school," Tony began as they left the city, "but it's entirely up to you as to whether or not you want to go. Pepper and I are probably going to have everything happen in the middle of the week, but if you would rather miss the last day and stay home, we can do that." Peter thought about it for a moment. There was a part of him that wouldn't mind missing the last day and spending time with Tony during the day, but another part of him needed the distraction for a couple hours. Not that he didn't appreciate what Tony was doing for him, but school offered a sense of familiarity in spite of what happened in the span of less than 24 hours. Plus, it would be great to see Ned and MJ. I think I want to go to school," Peter said. "I mean, it's only for a couple hours. Plus, we'll get our yearbooks, and I'll get to see Ned and MJ if that's okay." "Of course, it's okay," Tony said incredulously, frequently diverting attention between Peter and the road. "In all honesty, I think May would want you to go to school." Peter looked at his hands on his lap nodding. Tony was right. May wouldn't want him to miss out on his last day of school for her, unless of course it was an emergency of some sort, but in this case, she wouldn't want him to sit on a couch all day. That was what she told him when Uncle Ben died almost 2 years ago. The memory flashed in his mind. "May, please don't send me to school," Peter said as he sobbed in her arms. They sat together on their living room couch. I can't, I don't know if I could just go and pretend nothing happened." It had only been 2 days since Ben had been shot and killed in front of Peter on that one fateful Friday night, and now it was Sunday night, which meant that Peter had to go back to school the next day. "Baby, I know," May said, hugging Peter even tighter, "but you have to. I don't want you to sit here all day. It's not good for you. You need to distract yourself." "How can I when Uncle Ben's gone?" Peter asked. "Because I know him," May replied, running a hand through Peter's curls. "And I know your uncle would want us to live our lives and to not be sad all the time. Ben would want you to go to school tomorrow and face the day like the strong kid he knew you are, the strong kid I know you are." The teenager didn't dare to reply as he hugged May tighter, allowing the tears to stream down his face. "Yeah, I think so too," Peter said as the memory faded into the back of his mind. Tony gave Peter a sad smile and reached over the console, patting him on the shoulder. "But if you ever change your mind and want to stay home," Peter mentally noted that Tony referred to the penthouse as home, "just say the word, kiddo." "Thanks, Mr. Stark," Peter replied. He mentally kicked himself for not referring to Tony by his first name, but Tony must have decided to let it slide for the moment. Speaking of school, aren't you supposed to be selling the tower at some point?" "I thought about it," Tony answered, "and Pepper and I decided not to go through with it. We liked having something in the city. Plus, you and I have been spending a lot of time in the lab recently, and we'll have more of a reason to use it now." "Really? Yeah, besides, you're not going to be able to commute to school from upstate. That's crazy." Well, that indirectly answered Peter's question about what was going to happen in terms of him going to school. Peter smiled again. "Yeah, that's true," he said. With a sigh, he leaned back, resting his head on the headrest. "It just feels so surreal, you know? Last night, I was with her, you know? She was there with me, and now, today, and now, I'm going to school without her around." "Unfortunately, kiddo, that's what happens," Tony finally said after a moment of silence. "One minute you're here, and then in just a split second," he couldn't finish it as he thought of the day he lost his parents, how 1 minute they were in their living room together, and then next thing he knew, Tony got a phone call that his parents were gone. Peter sighed. They said she died in surgery, he said looking out the window. I was talking to her as if she was just unconscious. It's so stupid, I should have realized. It's not stupid, kid, Tony quickly interjected. You were in an accident. You were knocked out. You weren't thinking clearly. I guess, Peter replied. He supposed that Tony was right. Even though it was just last night, it all happened so fast, which made it harder to piece things together, but he remembered waking up in the car after the fact. No, I guess, Tony said firmly. It's the truth, buddy. Quite frankly, he was somewhat relieved that Peter found out later that May died in the accident. The doctor mentioned to him last night that Peter could show signs of survivor's guilt as he was the only one to survive, and if he saw that his aunt was dead, that would have made things worse. He remembered the video of his parents and his knuckles tightened on the steering wheel as he thought of Barnes, the Winter Soldier, killing his father, moving his body back into the car, right in front of his mother, before ending her life as well. Peter was about to say something else when he noticed Tony's white knuckles on the steering wheel. Mr. Stark? He tried. Tony? Are you okay? Why yeah, I'm fine, Peter, he replied. Just thinking about something, that's all. Thankfully, Peter decided not to push him to talk more and simply leaned back against the seat enjoying the smooth ride. Chapter 7. Tony stole a glance at Peter, who ended up falling asleep a few minutes later, and he couldn't help but smile just a little. After everything the teen had gone through, he deserved a little nap. The veteran superhero sighed. The whole morning, he was keeping calm on the outside for Peter's sake, but on the inside, he was freaking out. He was now charged with the care of Peter Parker, a kid who just lost his last living relative. Granted, again, he had known Peter, and Peter knew him. However, he was the kid's guardian now, a parent. Was he capable? So far, things were going okay, sort of. He and Peter talked about the meeting, and Peter took it well as any grieving teenager could. Whether he was glad that he didn't have to go into the system or that his mentor took him in, or both, Peter showed his appreciation while also trying to process his aunt's death. But Tony knew that he was right. Peter needed someone he trusted, just as he told the social worker, just as May told him months ago, after the kidnapping incident. May, I don't know, Tony said as he looked between her and Peter, who was sound asleep in the bed next to him in the med bay. Tony, May said, cutting him off, don't you see how much you mean to him? He trusts you, implicitly. He cares about you, just as you care about him. Of course, I care about him, Tony reaffirmed, but May asked, urging him to continue. I'm not exactly parent, guardian material. I never really was. May chuckled as she perched herself on the foot of Tony's bed. How do you think my husband and I felt when Richard and Mary named us as Peter's guardians in their will? We obviously never expected anything to happen to them, but we were scared out of our minds. We didn't think we'd be good guardians for Peter. We didn't have any children of our own, and before they died, Rich and Mary brought Peter over for us to watch for a few hours. Tony didn't dare say a word, allowing May to continue. And then we realized that we would do anything for Peter, and that we only would have needed to try our best to care for him and love him, which we already did. May smiled at the veteran superhero. And you just said you care about him. You gave him a new suit with all these fancy gadgets and gizmos. You took his suit away when you felt he was getting in over his head. You've been mentoring him, training him, and supporting him for almost a year. He talks to you about things and asks for advice. Tony released a breath he didn't realize he was holding. He had no idea May viewed him in this light. And let's not forget that you just fought tooth and nail to save him and to get the both of you out of there not too long ago. Well, I mean, there was no way I was going to let anything happen to him. All I could think about was getting Peter out of there. Everything else she had mentioned, he didn't think much of it. All he knew when he first discovered this vigilante on YouTube was that he needed an upgrade, an assurance of safety, and the more time he spent with Peter, all the way from Germany to the Vulture incident, the more he came to care about the kid and to want to support him. He didn't think much of it. Perhaps, there were a few times, especially during the Vulture situation, where his actions confused him, but only because he never acted like that before. All in all, Tony never once thought to make himself a parental figure to Peter. He just sort of did everything he did, all because he cared about the kid. That's why I want to do this, May finally said. He trusts you, Tony, and I know he cares about you just as you care about him. If anything happens, I want you to be the one who's there for him. Tony looked at May for a long minute before looking away in deep thought, and May could see that he was heavily considering what she said. "Please, Tony," she said. "There's no one else but you." Tony gave her a small smile and nodded. "I'd be honored, May," he said. Tony smiled as the memory faded back into his mind. He realized he was right when he told Peter that he and May never anticipated this day coming so fast and so soon, too soon. However, May's confidence and trust eased his nerves somewhat, but now that it was happening, it still made his heart pound knowing that Peter would be under his care officially in probably a number of days. He then took another glance and couldn't help but smile at his ward mentee, Kid, sleeping soundly. Somehow, they were going to get through this. "Peter, Peter, wake up," a very familiar voice said softly. Peter did as the voice said and opened his eyes only to see Tony smiling at him, and he couldn't help but smile in return. "Yeah?" he asked. Tony gestured with his head telling Peter to look out his window. "We're here," he replied. The teen did what he was told and looked out the passenger window, and sure enough, he saw that they were parked in front of the Avengers compound. They finally arrived. He turned to look at Tony smiling and then back at the building. Peter had been to the compound a few times over the past year, but it never failed to make his heart pound to see the building that served as the headquarters for Earth's mightiest heroes looming over him, up this close. Despite the events that occurred in Germany, it was an amazing feeling for a teenaged boy. "So, do you want to sit in the car all day staring or do you want to go in?" Tony asked with a smile on his face. "Oh no, we should go in," Peter said quickly, unbuckling his seat belt and opening the car door. Tony couldn't help but chuckle as he followed suit after turning off the car. "We'll head to the med bay first," he said as he led Peter into the building. "Dr. Cho is waiting for us there, and she and I can work on the pain medication to work with your metabolism. Then we can meet up with Rhodey and Vision." Peter quickly noticed that Tony only referred to only two of his fellow Avengers. Tony briefly mentioned once that Black Widow went on the run, after she let Captain America and his team go at the airport in Germany, and Peter always felt that this was hard for the billionaire to talk about and never pressed the issue. He knew that the Black Panther went back to Wakanda. However, there was one Avenger in particular that Tony hardly mentioned. "Still no luck in tracking down Dr. Banner?" Peter asked as they walked in. Tony shook his head. "Nope," he replied. "He's been gone ever since the whole Hulk incident when we fought Ultron, kid. As of now, I don't think he wants to be found, especially after the whole thing with the Accords. Natasha had said so herself." "You really think he'd be on our side right now?" "Right," Peter had forgotten about that. It was the whole reason the Avengers turned against each other in the first place, on top of the Winter Soldier being accused of various crimes, and if that was the case, he could understand why Tony wouldn't want to try to find Bruce Banner, also known as the Hulk, with the Accords. Bruce might not have been able to control the Hulk, at least not completely, and there was no doubt that Ross and the government would jump on that. "Maybe once things calm down, Dr. Banner can finally come back," Peter said after a moment of silence. Tony smiled as he led the teenager superhero into the med bay. "Your optimism never ceases to amaze me, kid," he said, "but I think it may be a while before this Accords shit is resolved for good." "Well, whatever happens with that, Tony," Peter said, "you know I got your back." Tony smiled yet again, and before he could say anything else, a female voice interrupted them. "Stark, good to see you again," Dr. Cho said as she walked up to them. "You too, Helen," Tony said, wrapping an arm around Peter. "You remember Peter, right?" "Of course," Dr. Cho said, looking to the teenager standing next to Tony. "It's good to see you again, Peter." "You too, Dr. Cho," Peter replied. "Tony told me what happened last night," she said with a frown. "I'm very sorry about your aunt." "The teenaged super Hank you," he replied. "Let's step into my lab," Dr. Cho said with a small smile, "and we can take a look at that head of yours." With that said, Peter and Tony followed the doctor down the hall to her office. The checkup went well. Thanks to Peter's enhanced healing, the cut on his head had already begun to heal overnight, much to their delight, and Dr. Cho and Tony were able to modify his pain medication to work with his metabolism. Once that was taken care of, Peter and Tony thanked Dr. Cho and ventured out of the med bay and went to find Rhodey and Vision, and thankfully, it didn't take very long. The veteran and the rookie found Rhodey exercising and Vision reading a book on a couch nearby in case the former needed some help. "Hey, honey bear, Vision," Tony said as he led Peter into the gym. "You remember Peter?" "Hello, Tony," Vision said, looking up from his book to direct his attention to Tony and Peter. "Hey, guys," Rhodey said as he looked over his shoulder before turning back to his exercise on the leg curl machine. "Hey, Colonel Rhodes, Vision," Peter said, giving them a small smile and a wave. "Good to see you guys again. One of these days, I'm going to get you to call me Rhodey, kid," Rhodey replied. "I'm still trying to get him to call me Tony," Tony replied. "We'll have to swap ideas on how to do that." The two best friends laughed as Peter rolled his eyes. He had met Rhodey and Vision before, and seeing how Tony and Rhodey acted around each other was always a clear sign as to how far back their friendship went and how much they trusted each other. It almost reminded him of his longtime friendship with Ned, and it also provided some relief that his new guardian at least had some friends from the Avengers to support him, especially a longtime friend like Rhodey. "So, Rhodes, why don't we head down to the lab?" Tony asked after a moment of silence. "I can take a look at those braces." "Sure thing," Rhodey replied as he walked over to Tony, patting him on the shoulder. "Can I come?" Peter asked with eagerness in his voice. Actually, kid, why don't you stay up here with Vision?" Tony quickly said before Rhodey could have a chance to respond. "This is going to be quick, and I need to talk to him about something, okay?" Tony felt his heart slightly break when he saw the eagerness leave Peter's face. He hoped that he wasn't taking it personally. "Oh, yeah, okay, sure," Peter said quickly. "We won't be long," Tony reassured. "I promise." "Tell you what, buddy," Rhodey said, moving closer to the teenager. "Why don't you and Vision set up one of our video games in the common room? We can play when Tony and I come back up." Thankfully, the smile returned to Peter's face as he nodded. "Sure, sounds like a plan," he said. Tony gave a small smile in return. "Have Friday get me if you need anything, okay?" "You got it, mister. Tony." Chapter 8. From the minute Tony told Peter that he needed to talk to Rhodey, the latter knew that something was amiss. He had only seen Peter a few times around the holidays or whenever Peter stayed over at the tower, and based on those few times, Peter and Tony were almost always in the lab together, even when Rhodey had Tony look at his leg braces. The Colonel and the billionaire had known each other for a long time, and it didn't take long for Rhodey to sense that something was up. However, for about 15 minutes after getting down to the lab, Tony still wasn't saying anything. All he did was mumble to himself as he removed Rhodey's braces from his legs, so Rhodey took it as a cue to say something. "So, you have something you want to tell me?" the Colonel finally asked. "Why would you think I have something to tell you?" Tony retorted. Rhodey was right. There was something he wanted to tell his best friend, something about a will and how he was now in charge of a certain teenager, but he wasn't sure how to bring it up. His only course of action was to tinker with his leg braces, blaming himself more and more for allowing this to happen in Germany. "Because you're doing that thing where you look like you're about to explode," Rhodey replied, "and you just told your junior lab partner that you wanted to come down here alone." Tony closed his eyes. He should have known that Rhodey would instantly pick up on the fact that something was up when he told Peter not to join him. The billionaire sighed after a moment. "Where do I even begin?" he asked. "From the beginning," Tony chuckled and rolled his eyes. "Okay, well, he turned to where Rhodey was sitting and sat down across from him. "It's about the kid." "What about him?" Rhodey asked. Tony ran a hand through his hair. "He and his aunt, May, they were driving home last night and got in a car accident." He wasn't looking directly at his best friend, but he could feel the Colonel's eyes on him and the wheels turning in his head. Peter was here, but where was May? The other driver ran through his red light and crashed into them, and May didn't make it. "Ah, shit," Rhodey said. He exhaled. "How's he doing?" "Not great," Tony replied. "I mean, he's fine now, but last night, Rhodey, he was so drained and sad," he exhaled. "I had never seen him like that before, you know?" "Well, you know better than anyone what it's like, the grief," Rhodey added after a moment. "Yeah," Tony replied, staring at his hands, "but I didn't handle it well at all. Not to mention, I was 21. Peter is going to be 16 in a couple months, and he lost his living relative." Rhodey nodded. He remembered all too well what the following days were like after Howard and Maria died that night for Tony. He was a mess, and he tried his hardest to hide it. However, no matter how Tony tried to avoid his grief and hide it from others, Rhodey was always able to see it. So, not that I'm trying to steer away from how Peter is handling this, he began, but how do you fit into all this? He had a feeling that he knew the answer, but he needed to hear it from Tony. Well, for starters, Tony replied as he sat back in his chair, he called me from the hospital and told me what happened, and I went to get him. A social worker was there ready to put him in the system. Slowly but surely, the pieces of the puzzle were coming together. And I'm guessing that's not what happened, Rhodey finally said, prompting Tony to continue. Nope, he looked at his best friend. Remember that thing May asked me about a few months ago? Yeah, but you never really bothered to explain what that was. Tony took a deep breath. She asked me if she could name me as Peter's guardian, in her will, in case, he still couldn't bring himself to say it out loud. Rhodey widened his eyes. You serious? The billionaire didn't say anything as he looked at the colonel. Wow, that's wow, so, now, you're Peter's guardian? In the eyes of the state, temporarily, but once we have a court hearing and all goes well, the judge will grant it permanently. It's not necessarily adoption, but it means that I will be able to take care of him for good. The social worker only wants to meet with Peter and me once a month to see how things are going for a while. No wonder you look so freaked out. This is huge. Yep, Tony sighed as he ran a hand through his hair. I'm scared out of my mind, Rhodes. I don't blame you, Tones. It's going to be different, a lot different. No shit, and I know I've known Peter for a while and that we trust each other and are familiar with each other and that he's stayed over with me before and all that, but, Rhodey, I don't know how to raise a teenager. Given my history alone, I'm not someone who could be trusted to take care of another human being. What if I become like Howard? Or what if I screw up and the social worker says I'm not fit for this? I could lose him, Rhodey, and we would never see each other again. He would never see his friends again most likely. Hey, Tones, take it easy, Rhodey said, reaching forward trying to calm his best friend. It's okay to be scared. In fact, I'd be concerned if you weren't scared. That already shows how much you care about Peter and that you want what's best for him, and all those upgrades you've given him, all the hours you've dedicated to spending time with him over the past year, the tough love you gave him. If that doesn't show how much you care about the kid and want to do right by him, then I don't know what is. But it's not raising him. All of those things I did while May was alive. We co-parented. I guess, occasionally when it was needed. But May, she handled that. I was Peter's mentor, someone who spent time with him occasionally. Rhodey realized that Tony had a valid point. Tony might have acted like a parent or mentor to Peter. But that was quite different from actually being a parent or a guardian in May's case. Okay, fair, he began. But let me ask you something. How did May feel about Peter? He was her entire world, Tony replied while having no idea as to why Rhodey was asking him this and where he was going with this. She and Ben took care of him after his parents died. And they loved him like he was their own son. He was all she had after her husband died. She told me that she refused to let anything happen to Peter. Okay, now, think about it this way, Rhodey continued. If May didn't trust you to be a good mentor to Peter, what do you think she would have done? She probably would have put a stop to it, Tony answered simply. She would have made sure he had nothing to do with me. Right, Rhodey replied, but she never did, which means she trusted you to keep her nephew, her entire world, safe whether he was out there as Spider-Man or staying over with you for the weekend. Tony, she wouldn't have named you as a guardian if she didn't think you could handle it. Tony stared at Rhodey before looking away again, only to realize that Rhodey was indeed right. May cared about Peter. She loved him more than anything, and she did everything in her power to make sure that he had a good life and was happy. It made sense that she would have done something if she didn't think that Tony was a good mentor to Peter, and then his mind flashed back to his conversation with May a few months ago. He trusts you, Tony, and I know he cares about you just as you care about him. She was always able to see that Tony cared about her nephew, and that and all they had been through together was enough for her. With that thought, some confidence grew inside of him, but it came to a halt when one question came to mind. But what if I screw up with him? Then you learn from it and keep going. There's going to be all kinds of bumps in the road, buddy, but knowing you, you'll get through it. And you're not going to be alone. You have Pepper, Happy, even Vision, and me. We're going to's no matter what. The billionaire smiled, feeling his confidence growing a little more. "Thanks, Rhodes," he said. Rhodey smiled in return. "Anytime. You would do the same for me." "Yeah, I guess I would," Tony said as he stood up from his chair and continued to work on his best friend's braces. "So, you think of anything else I can add to these?" "You know, I still can't believe you used to be Mr. Stark's AI," Peter said as he set up the gaming system at the TV as Vision sat on the couch behind him. "Ah, yes, I remember my time as Jarvis quite fondly," Vision replied with a small smile. "Although, he hardly ever listened to my suggestions to test his new inventions and upgrades." Peter couldn't help but chuckle at Vision's comment. "He barely listens to Friday," he replied, earning a chuckle from Vision. "Don't tell him I said that, by the way." "Your secret is safe with me," Vision replied. "Are you spending the weekend with Tony again?" Peter felt his blood run cold at the question. He knew Vision meant well, but it also became clear that Tony didn't inform the remaining Avengers as to what happened to him and May. He supposed that that made sense. Given everything that happened within the span of 24 hours, there was no time to do that, between the accident and their conversation from that morning. Peter said as he finally finished setting up the gaming system and the game. "Well, actually, Vision, I'm living with him, my aunt and I." He moved to sit on the couch next to Vision. "We got in a car accident, and she didn't make it." "Oh dear, I'm so terribly sorry, Peter," Vision replied. "Rhodey and I had no idea." No, it's okay," Peter said as he held up his hands. "I didn't expect you to. The only people who know are Mr. Stark, Ms. Potts, Happy, and my best friend." "I see," Vision replied. "And my aunt apparently named Mr. Stark as my guardian," Peter continued. "So now, once a judge approves, he can take care of me permanently." Well, given how close you and Stark had gotten over time, it would seem that May Parker saw that and deemed Stark as someone who is capable of caring for you. "Yeah, I mean, he's done a lot for me, and so far, he's trying his best. He doesn't want to see me go into a foster home." He knew that Vision was right. May was always an amazing person like that. She always seemed to recognize if something was good or bad. Sure, she expressed her doubts about the Stark internship, but once she realized what was going on and that Peter was Spider-Man, she never tried to get him to stop. She respected it and tried her best to support him in any way. There were even times when she and Tony teamed up and co-parented a few times. "Well, I'm sure you two will adjust," Vision replied. "Tony cares a lot about you, and if I'm correct, you care about him, too." Peter smiled at Vision. Oddly enough, hearing Tony's former AI offer his support made him feel a little better, more hopeful. He knew he cared about Tony, and he knew that Tony cared about him as well. May said so herself. "They both care deeply about you." She of course referred to Ben as well, but she showed how much she recognized how important Tony and Peter were to each other as well. Now, hearing someone else, one of the remaining Avengers, express that thought as well made him smile and somewhat more confident. Not long after Peter's conversation with Vision, Tony and Rhodey returned from the lab, and from what Peter could see, Tony seemed like he was in a good mood. He didn't seem upset or angry, which could only mean that whatever he talked about with Rhodey helped him feel better. The rookie superhero made a mental note to ask him about it later on the way back to the tower. For now, he just needed to enjoy the day with Vision and Rhodey, and he could tell that the billionaire needed that too. As soon as the two best friends returned, they were ready to start the video game, which was usual Mario Kart. Eventually, Peter ended up winning with Rhodey coming in a very close second and with Tony and Vision behind them. So far, the day was a good distraction for Peter. However, every once in a while, Peter found himself remembering his circumstances. May was gone, dead, and while he also remembered that Tony was his new legal guardian, the pain in his heart, the grief was still there. The whole time he wished she was there enjoying this day with them, not dead, but he pushed through the grief trying not to burst out crying. However, it wasn't until the pizza they ordered for lunch came. He thought about all the pizza nights they used to have together, and that was enough for the tears to form in his eyes again. He tried to make it look like he was only yawning, but when that didn't work, he quickly excused himself and left the common room, leaving Tony, Rhodey, and Vision in a state of confusion. Although, Tony had an idea as to what was going on, but he was once again caught in the dilemma as to whether or not he should check on his charge or kid. The terminology was still a little fuzzy. The billionaire looked at the Colonel and his former AI. who were looking at him clearly trying to see what he would do. He wasn't sure what happened, but he suddenly stood up forgetting about his pizza and walked out of the room. For a teenager, Peter was able to get out of the compound pretty quickly. Thankfully, all Tony had to do was ask Friday. "Peter is currently in the back at the dock, boss," the AI replied. "Thanks, Fry," Tony replied absent-mindedly as he quickly made his way out of the compound. Sure enough, he found himself in the backyard of the compound looking out over the lake, and it didn't take him long to find Peter sitting on the dock. Tony wasted no time in walking over to him. The kid had his back to him, but from the tone of his voice when he left, he had a feeling that tears weren't too far behind. That was to be expected given that May had been gone for a day, only 24 hours. The billionaire kept walking until he was right next to Peter, and he gently placed his hand on Peter's back and felt Peter jump slightly. He must have known that it was Tony because he didn't look at him. "You want to be alone, kid?" he asked, although he felt like he knew what the answer was. He was right. Peter shook his head. Tony sat down on the bench next to him, wrapping an arm around him, pulling him close so that his head was on Tony's shoulder. "I'm sorry," Peter finally said after a moment. "I don't mean to get upset. He took a shaky breath, "it's stupid. I took a look at the pizza and," he sniffled, it made me think of all the times May and I would get pizza." Tears flowed down his cheeks. "Now, we're never going to get to do that again," he sobbed. I'm sorry, Peter, listening to me," Tony replied, wrapping his arm tighter around him. "You don't need to apologize for grieving, okay? You hear me? But I shouldn't be just crying out of nowhere. I mean," he sniffed, I'm a teenager, a superhero, and how does that my gratitude to you, for what you're doing for me?" Hey, that's bullshit. Okay, Tony retorted. "Maturity and gratitude have nothing to do with grief. Everyone needs to deal with it in his or her own way, and that means letting it out instead of bottling it up. So, if you ever need to cry or scream or whatever you need to do to let out the grief, you can come find me, and we can go somewhere private, like here, and just let it out. Or if you want to be by yourself or can't find me, if there's something else you want to talk to, that works, too, okay? You don't need to hide anything or bottle anything up, okay?" The teen slowly nodded. It reminded him of what May had said to him after Ben died, that it was okay to let it out. He didn't remember crying much after the fact, but the first few days were rough. However, becoming Spider-Man was an outlet for him, so maybe it could work again. He wasn't sure. Right now, like whenever May held him after Ben died, being here with Tony made him feel safe, and for now, that was enough for him as he slowly lifted his right arm from his lap and reached up to grip Tony's shirt, seeking more comfort, all while hoping that he wasn't overstepping boundaries. Tony felt Peter's hand grip his shirt and couldn't help the smile that formed on his face and a warm feeling. Ever since that day Peter turned down the Avengers, he and Peter usually patted each other on the shoulder or the back and embraced each other from the side, wrapping an arm around the shoulders. Hugs were few between them, especially after he joked with Peter that day in the car that they weren't there yet. However, now, without even second-guessing himself, he wrapped his other arm around Peter, pulling him into a full embrace. More tears streamed down Peter's face as he turned his body, so that his arms wrapped around Tony's middle and his face buried in Tony's shoulder. "Are you trying to tell me we're there, Mr. Star, Tony?" he asked with a small smile. Tony chuckled as he hugged Peter just a little tighter. It had become a little inside joke between them during the few times they did share a hug. "Yeah, kid," he said quietly. "We're there. Considering that you're calling me Tony and living with me, it would be weird if we weren't." Peter laughed. "This is nice," he said with a small smile growing just a little wider. I've liked our hugs." "Yeah, Pete," Tony replied, "it is nice." He paused for a moment before continuing. "You ready to go back inside? Can we stay out here for a few more minutes? You got it, kid." Chapter 9. A few minutes passed before Peter was finally ready to go back into the compound, and Tony gladly took his charge back into the building. Thankfully, Rhodey and Vision didn't try to pry as to what happened. However, they both sent Tony questioning looks, to which Tony responded with a small smile and a nod as if to say that Peter was okay. The rest of the afternoon continued nicely as they played Mario Kart together, and the competition ended after 4 rounds with Peter winning the last 2 and Tony winning the first 2 rounds. Once Peter got over the adrenaline rush, He realized that he forgot to call MJ like he said he would. Once he excused himself to make the call, he went into the hallway just outside the common room and called MJ. "Hey," she said after 2 rings. She obviously knew who it was. "Hey, MJ," Peter said. "What's up?" "Not much," she replied. "Just doing some research on the Black Dahlia." "Black Dahlia?" Peter asked, furrowing his eyebrows together. The name sounded familiar because MJ mentioned it before to him and Ned. "You know, the murder," MJ replied. "Oh, right," Peter said, nodding. "The one with the girl, who?" "Yeah, that one," MJ interjected. Peter chuckled at the memory of when she first told him and Ned. As bizarre as it was, it felt somewhat normal. Like Tony, MJ was so far keeping him grounded despite what was going on. "So, what's going on, Parker?" she finally asked after a moment of a slightly awkward silence. "I have a feeling you didn't call me just to chat." "Oh yeah, right," Peter suddenly said. "I'm sorry. I need to talk to you about something that happened." What are you talking about?" The teenaged vigilante heard the concern in her voice. He wasn't exactly sure how to tell someone like MJ about his aunt dying the night before and him staying with Tony Stark himself, but like with Ned, he figured it was better to just get it out of the way and to just break the news. Tears started to form in his eyes. "My Aunt May and I. We were in a car accident last night." "What? Oh my God, are you guys okay? I mean, Ned said you were going to call me today, but I thought it was, I don't know." Never in his life had Peter ever heard Michelle Jones so speechless, but he was thankful that Ned at least gave her a heads up before he could call. Well, that's what I had to tell you," he replied as he slid down the wall to sit on the floor. My aunt didn't make it last night. She was hurt pretty badly, and, she didn't make it." "Wow," MJ sighed as if someone punched her in the stomach. "Oh my God, Peter, I'm so sorry to hear that." Peter could feel the tears brimming in his eyes yet again, but for some reason, whether it was because Tony told him it was okay to cry or because he trusted MJ to not judge him, maybe both, he didn't make a move to wipe away the tears. Thanks," he replied. "So, what's happening with you now?" MJ suddenly asked after a moment of silence. "I mean, you're obviously not at the hospital because Ned would have told me if you were, and you said May was all you had left." This was obviously MJ's way of asking what was going to happen to him now, if he was going to be placed in the system or if he was going to have to leave. Also, it just showed more and more how smart and observant she was. Of course, Ned would have said if Peter was still at a hospital. "Well, long story short. Before this happened, May named Mr. Stark as a backup guardian for me in her will," he replied, "and Mr. Stark is taking me in." "Are you serious?" "Yeah, crazy, huh? She must really trust him." That's great, Peter. "So, I guess this means you won't be leaving Midtown. I mean, Ned would miss you a lot." Peter couldn't help but smile. "Yeah, Ned doesn't have to worry," he replied. "I'm not going anywhere. Tony said so himself." "Good, it would suck to not have you on Decathlon next year. I need help keeping Flash in line." Peter laughed yet again. As much as he loved talking to Tony and hanging out with the Avengers, it felt good talking to MJ. He wasn't sure if it was because she was his age or because of her way of lightening the mood somewhat, but it helped. So, listen, Parker," she finally said after a moment, "and my parents will want to know the arrangements, so." "Oh, yeah, I'll give you those once Tony gets all that together." "Good, and if you ever want to hang out or anything, you know I'll be around over the summer." "Yeah, I'd like that. Thanks, MJ. Maybe, you can tell me more about the Black Dahlia murder." "Definitely, so, will I see you at school on Monday?" "Of course, I wouldn't miss the last day of school." "Good, I'll see you then." "See you, MJ." With that said, both teens hung up, and Peter was able to rejoin Tony, Rhodey, and Vision with a smile on his face. However, he didn't miss the smirks on Tony and Rhodey's faces when he said that MJ suggested hanging out over the summer. He just rolled his eyes and went on with the rest of the afternoon. About an hour or two later, Peter and Tony said their goodbyes to Rhodey and Vision, promising to meet up again on Monday after Peter would get home from school. Tony and Peter hopped into the car and took off, making their way back to the city, and the billionaire was able to see that Peter was in a better mood. The grief was still there. It was always going to be there under the surface, but it was easy to see that the kid needed the distraction today. Quite frankly, he needed it too. He needed the confidence boost from Rhodey. He needed the moment, that hug with Peter to give him a boost in thinking that May made the right choice in naming him as Peter's guardian. Rhodey was right. Yes, mistakes would be made, and there would be some bumps in the road. However, like Rhodey also said, he and Peter trusted each other and had been through a lot together, and like he himself told Peter this morning, they were a great team. They could figure out this new situation and whatever came at them along the way, just as they had been for the past year. Besides, Rhodey had another valid point. If she didn't think that Tony was capable of taking care of her nephew, her entire world, she wouldn't have asked him. She would have made sure that they never interacted again if she thought Peter was in any danger. Maybe he got this after all. Only time would tell. "Hey, Tony?" Peter suddenly said as they rode the elevator to the penthouse. "Yeah, bud?" Tony replied, turning to the teen standing next to him. I was kind of wondering if maybe we can watch a movie or something," Peter suggested sheepishly. Tony smiled and wrapped an arm around Peter, holding him close to his side. "Of course," he said. "How about we get changed and order up some shawarmas?" The teen nodded and smiled, wrapping an arm around Tony in return. The elevator opened up in the penthouse, and as soon as Tony told Friday to order from shawarmas, both he and Tony went to their respective rooms to change into their pajamas. As soon as they were ready, their order finally came, and they made themselves comfortable in the living room on the couch with their food in the front of the TV. They then finally decided on a movie, a Star Wars move at Peter's request, which Tony didn't mind at all. "There's something I wanted to tell you, buddy," Tony said as the movie continued. Peter picked up his head to look at Tony. They had finished their dinner about a half hour ago, and they were now sitting together on the couch with Tony's arm around Peter and Peter's head on Tony's shoulder. Both of them had their feet resting on the coffee table. "Yeah?" he asked. I didn't want to say anything in front of Rhodey and Vision," the billionaire replied, "but the hospital called me while you were on the phone with MJ. They, moved May to the funeral home, so at some point, we had to go over there." Peter didn't say anything as he nodded. Tears formed in his eyes as he realized was getting closer to when he would have to say goodbye to May forever. He and Tony would have to make decisions on her coffin, the flowers, her outfit. He sighed as he leaned on Tony's shoulder as the tears flowed down his cheeks. "I can't believe this is happening," he said in a whisper. Before Tony could even say anything, he sat up, realizing how that sounded. "Please don't take that the wrong way. I just meant that." Relax, kid," Tony quickly said, keeping his arm around Peter. "It's okay, I know what you meant. I really appreciate what you're doing for me," Peter continued, "and I'm glad I get to live with you. With May, He sighed a shaky breath as Tony let him finish. May, after my uncle died, I always thought it would be just us, you know? And now," he closed his eyes as more tears flowed. Feeling his heart breaking even more for his charge, Tony gently tugged Peter back down so that the teen was resting his head on the former's chest, and without much hesitation, he wrapped both arms around Peter, holding him tightly. He felt pretty bad for bringing this up, but he knew that he would have felt worse if he sprung this on Peter tomorrow. Peter needed time to process this and to come to terms with everything. "I'm going to take care of everything, buddy," Tony finally said after a quick minute. "You're not going to be alone in this. I'm sorry, I wanted to tell you beforehand." No, it's okay," Peter replied, sniffling. "I'm glad you told me. When Ben died, May tried her hardest to be strong for him, and while he appreciated it, he wanted to help in any way he could. Now, Tony was telling him what was happening, and while the billionaire said he would take care of things, he was making an effort to keep Peter in the loop, which the teen appreciated. "Are you sure?" Tony asked. Peter nodded as he hugged his guardian tightly. "Okay," Tony replied, returning the gesture, "but if you don't want to make any of those decisions, just tell me, okay? Pepper and I could always do it." Thank you so much, Tony," Peter said after a moment, "for everything. You really don't have to do any of this." "It's not because I have to," Tony replied. "I want to, kid. I want you here. I want to help you and to be there for you." Peter felt his heart swell hearing Tony say that he wanted to help him and to be there for him. More importantly, he said he wanted him here living with him. He knew Tony wanted him as a mentee and an intern, and the billionaire had proven that time and time again. Now, however, if all went well, Tony would soon officially be his guardian and charged with legally taking care of him, and it was a great feeling to hear that this was something he wanted. "Thank you, again," he said. Tony chuckled. "You don't need to thank me, kid," the billionaire replied. "Now, what do you say we finish the movie?" Peter smiled. "Sounds good," he replied. The movie continued on, as they stayed wrapped in each other's arms, and soon enough, as the end credits rolled on the screen, Tony felt Peter's head slowly move down his chest. Tony furrowed his eyebrows together. "Kid?" he asked softly. Peter didn't answer, but Tony barely missed the soft snores coming from the teenager. Tony chuckled. Whenever Peter stayed over for the weekend or overnight for a movie night, it usually ended with one or both of them falling asleep on the couch. Usually, they would wake up and just go to bed, but something stopped Tony from waking up his protégé. The kid only had a few hours of sleep the night before after the hospital, and then they had a day at the compound. He couldn't bring himself to wake Peter up and decided to take over measures. Knowing the couch wouldn't be all that comfortable, Tony slowly but surely gathered Peter into his arms, carrying him under his back and knees. And then Tony slowly stood up with Peter sleeping in his arms and slowly walked toward Peter's bedroom. It was no longer a guest room. It hadn't been for a while. As soon as they were in the room, Tony gently placed the kid on his bed and brought the covers up to his chin. The billionaire sighed as he sat on the edge of the bed, trying not to wake Peter up. He couldn't help but notice how peaceful Peter looked while asleep, completely shielded away from the harsh reality. He knew Peter was thankful that his mentor was taking him in, and he knew that Peter trusted him. He also knew that Peter was grieving his aunt, his last living relative, his family, and that was something that would never go away. As for himself, he was glad to have Peter with him. He was grateful that he would get to see Peter every day, but given the circumstances, how could he be happy when it resulted because of a death? Perhaps, like everything else, he would figure it out. Both he and Peter would figure this situation out, together. Like he said to the kid, they were a team no matter what, and he wasn't going to give up, that was for sure. With that thought, Tony slowly reached forward and ran ahead through Peter's soft curls, careful not to wake him. "I promise, May," Tony whispered. "I'm going to be there for him. I'll keep him safe, just as I always have been, and Pep, Rhodey, and Happy will help too. Our Peter will be just fine." Chapter 10. Peter fluttered his eyes open as the sunlight peeked into the blinds over the bed. He suddenly froze when he realized where he was. He was in a bed, and confusion ran through his head. The last thing he remembered was watching a movie with Tony and Tony telling him about May, and how they needed to make the arrangements tomorrow, so that was today, unless it was a dream. The teen looked around the room only to sadly realize that it wasn't a dream. May was dead, killed in that car accident, just 2 days ago, and he couldn't save her. That harsh realization dawned on him as he remembered that last moment before that car plowed into them. "Let me know if I need to pull over when it gets worse." May. Crash. The teen jolted at the memory of the car ramming into theirs. He briefly remembered hearing May's scream at the moment of impact before he was knocked out. It felt like something out of his worst nightmare. That was the second time he failed to save a loved one. He failed to save Ben when he got shot, and now, he failed to save May in the accident. How could he let that happen? How could he not react in time? He could only sigh in utter sadness and defeat. "Peter, boss would like me to inform you that breakfast is ready." "Thanks, Friday," Peter muttered. "Tell him I'll be there in a minute." Peter then mustered whatever strength he had and got up out of bed. His stomach growled, and I provided some motivation to get him out of bed. His body felt like lead, and he immediately wanted to stay in bed. However, he continued, despite it, and left his bedroom to join Tony in the kitchen. He walked out into the hallway and made his way into the kitchen. But he quickly stopped in his tracks when he saw that his mentor wasn't alone. Pepper Potts was sitting at the counter as Tony placed food on each of the plates. "Morning, kid," Tony said, looking up at Peter. Pepper turned to look at Peter and quickly stood up, walking over to him. "Hey, sweetie," she said, gathering him into her arms. "Hi, Miss Potts," Peter said, hugging her back and feeling the tears well up again. "I'm so sorry, Peter," she said softly, rubbing his back while they embraced. Thank you, Ms. Potts," Peter said as he sobbed, not really caring if he ruined her white shirt. He felt bad, but not enough to stop crying. He and Pepper had seen each other often over the course of the past 10 months. "I am sorry." No sorry, kid," Tony said quickly before Pepper could respond. "He's right, you know," Pepper quickly added, rubbing Peter's back. Peter gave a soft chuckle through his little sobs. "Okay," he said. "Ah, sweetheart," Pepper whispered into his curls, "there are no words." As much as Tony wanted nothing more than to join the hug with Peter and Pepper, his ward, charge, and his fiancée, he stood back, allowing them to share a moment. Over the past 10 months and the 2 days since the accident, Peter knew he was able to seek comfort from Tony and was given it, no questions asked. However, given that he and Pepper were going to be married in the near future, Peter needed to know that Pepper would be there to help him through this ordeal as well. It was a minute before Pepper finally pulled away to look at Peter, allowing her to see his bloodshot eyes. "I'm sorry I didn't see you yesterday," Pepper finally said after a moment. "Oh, you don't have to apologize, Miss Potts," Peter said, wiping the tears from his eyes. Tony had told him that Pepper couldn't be around yesterday as she was busy with work, which he understood, of course. While both Ben and May worked, after Ben died, it was always hard for May to be in 2 places at once, and since Pepper was the CEO of Stark Industries, that was even more understandable. First of all, if you're finally on first-name basis with Tony and Rhodey, Pepper began gripping onto Peter's arms. "Still working on it," Tony interjected as he placed the food on the plates for the 3 of them. "It's Pepper," Pepper continued without missing a beat. "Second of all, I know, but I still promise you that today is just going to be the 3 of us, okay?" Peter couldn't help but give a small smile at the CEO of Stark Industries, and he nodded. "Okay, Pepper," he said in a whisper. Tony, Pepper, and Rhodey were all attempting to get him to use their names, and they had been trying for a long time. However, they were adamant now since Peter was living with one of them. "Good, now, come on," she said, guiding Peter to the counter. "You need something in your stomach." The teenaged vigilante chuckled as he sat down at the counter with Pepper and Tony. "So, what are we supposed to do today?" he asked as he began to pick at his food. "Well, I figured that we could stop by the apartment first," Tony replied. "We can sort through what you want to keep and, see what you want to do with." He trailed off, not exactly wanting to say what he needed to say out loud. "And we don't have to do everything today," Pepper quickly added. "We can just focus on your things and the things we need and go back whenever you want for the rest." "That's right," Tony added. "I can talk to the superintendent and pull some strings to pay for rent for another month or 2. It's up to you." Tony felt his heart break seeing Peter ponder over this. It was expected that the child worry about their parent or guardian's funeral. That was how the natural order of things was supposed to be, but not at the age of 15 going on 16. It was too young. Peter was too young to deal with this, but that only made Tony want to make this as quick as possible. It was going to be painful. That was what came with losing a beloved family member, but May also deserved to be honored and cherished by those she loved. Yeah, I think we should just get what I need and deal with what May will be." He took a shaky breath, buried with. He took another shaky breath as he ran a hand through his hair as he felt the grief increase a little within him. "Kid, listen to me," Tony said, taking Peter's hand in his. "If anything at any point gets to be too much, at the apartment or the funeral home, you just say the word, okay?" "That's right," Pepper added, rubbing Peter's back. "Tony and I will be there every step of the way. If you need us to take care of something, you tell us." Peter managed to look at Pepper and Tony, smiling at them. "Thanks, guys, really," he said quietly. "You really don't." Nope, we want to, kid, end of story." Pepper couldn't help but notice Peter's smile widen just a little bit at Tony. After breakfast, Peter quickly showered and dressed for the day, and just as Pepper promised, the 3 of them began to spend the day together. Normally, Peter would be excited to spend the entire day with his mentor and his fiancée, but knowing that he had to go to his and May's apartment and move out, forever, formed a tight knot in his stomach. Thankfully, Pepper and Tony planned this process so that it didn't happen all in one day. Today, they were just focusing on moving Peter's clothes and other things out of the apartment and to go through May's things for the wake and funeral. Tony told him that his furniture would be taken care of on Monday while he would be at school, and the rest of May's things would come later when Peter was ready. Pepper didn't say anything to either Peter or Tony, but Pepper had to wonder if this came from Tony wishing that someone had done this for him when his parents died. Ever since Tony became Peter's mentor, she noticed they'd gotten closer, started trusting each other as more than mentor and protege, more like father and son, and it was something both she and May noticed more and more over time. They both cared about each other and looked out for each other. Whether it was divine intervention, fate, destiny, the Accords, or an internet video, it was pretty clear that Peter and Tony belonged together and needed each other. Tony needed Peter to bring in some light after the Civil War with the Rogue Avengers, after Natasha betrayed him, and Peter needed Tony to guide him in his life as a superhero, and now as a guardian to help him grieve the loss of a loved one, something Obadiah didn't do for Tony. Soon enough, Tony pulled into a space right in front of the apartment building in Queens. "Okay, here we are," Tony said solemnly as he turned the car off. He turned to Peter, who was sitting in the backseat. As much as he wished that he could be there in the back with him, he knew that it was better for Peter if it was just the three of them. Plus, Happy, Vision, and Rhodey said they would help with the furniture. "You ready, kiddo?" Peter nodded. "Well, not ready, but I have to be," he replied. Tony and Pepper snuck a glance at each other before turning back to Peter, and Tony reached out and took Peter's hand into his. "We're right there with you," he said. "You call the shots today, okay?" "Okay," Peter said in barely a whisper. He couldn't help but notice Tony telling him that over the past 48 hours. He had been so overwhelmed with grief that he tended to lose track of time, and he appreciated it. He was glad that Tony and Pepper were letting him make some decisions. He was probably going to need them to take over in some parts, but it was nice that his mentor, guardian and his fiancée were initially letting him take some control of the current circumstances. He couldn't control the events regarding the accident, or May's death, but he was allowed to have some control here. It kept him distracted, grounded. Peter then took a deep breath and looked at Tony and Pepper. "I'm ready." With that said, the three of them got out of the Audi, and Peter led Tony and Pepper up to his and May's apartment with keys in hand. Thankfully, like 2 nights ago, the building was quiet, so no one was around to ask questions. He was nowhere near ready for that part, and as soon as he got to the door to the apartment with the 2 adults behind him, he took out the keys and unlocked the door. The door opened, and at first, Peter forgot that he was at the apartment only a few nights ago. It felt like a lifetime ago, and knowing that it was only a matter of time before it was completely empty with no trace of the Parkers living here, made his stomach twist. The boy was jolted out of his thoughts when he felt a hand on his shoulder. "You okay, kid?" Tony asked. Peter quickly looked at him and nodded frantically. "Okay, how about you and I pack up your stuff?" Tony suggested. "And I can get all the perishables out of the fridge?" Pepper added. "After that, you can pick out a few things for May." Peter looked to Pepper and nodded. Tony gently guided Peter toward his room. When the 2 of them were here after the accident, the kid broke down in the room by himself, and Tony refused to let that happen again. He and Pepper agreed to let Peter have his alone time if he asked, but if not, then they agreed to try to be there for him if possible. The 3 of them quickly got to work. Tony and Peter packed the latter's clothes and other belongings in the cardboard boxes they brought, while Pepper threw out anything that was or already expired while taking notes as to what kind of food Peter liked. She had a feeling that Tony had some idea given how often Peter stayed over at the tower and the compound, but it couldn't hurt to be extra sure. "Okay," Tony said as he duct-taped a box of Peter's pants. "That's another box to go down to the car." "This one, too," Peter said as he duct-taped a box of his shirts and slid it toward the door. "Can I have another one?" "Here you go, kiddo," Tony replied as he grabbed another box for Peter to take. Peter smiled as he took the box and turned to grab a few things from his night table and stopped in his tracks when his brown eyes rested on the picture that stood there. The smile vanished from the boy's face as a lump formed in his throat. It was a picture of him, May, and Ben. The 3 of them were in a restaurant in the city. May and Ben were standing behind him smiling proudly while he sat down wearing a blue graduation cap. Peter knew immediately what day it was taken. It was his 8th grade graduation ceremony, on a warm June night, just about a week or so before Ben was killed in front of him. Peter remembered framing the picture right after the funeral and the tears in May's eyes when he told her that this would help him remember his uncle and help Ben watch over him. He was only 13 going on 14 years old, grasping the finality of death and the concept of losing a loved one. He took the picture into his hands staring at it. "Hey, kid, Tony stopped when he saw his charge kneeling on the floor with the picture frame. It didn't take a rocket scientist to figure out what the picture was. He had caught mere glimpses of the picture whenever he came to visit the Parkers' apartment after meeting Peter. He slowly stood up and sat down on Peter's bed, looking over the boy's shoulder at the picture and placing his hand on Peter's shoulder. This was taken only a few weeks before. Peter stopped. It was bad enough to mourn May, but he didn't feel like remembering Ben's death. We went out to dinner, just the three of us, like how it was him, Tony, and Pepper now. Peter sniffled as tears fell from his eyes before wiping them away. You know, I never told you this. But Peter looked up at Tony with a sad smile. Take a wild guess as to who got me into Star Wars. Your uncle was a fan of Star Wars. Aw man. He loved them. Whenever I was sick or feeling sad, we used to always curl up on the couch and watch them all night long, stuffing our faces with popcorn. One Halloween, back when I was, I don't know, 7, we both dressed up as Luke and Anakin Skywalker. I should actually try to find that picture. Tony couldn't help but laugh. Well, it's pretty clear his love for Star Wars made an impression, he said as he ruffled Peter's hair. He thought back on all the times Peter came for a movie night or stayed over the weekend. Usually, they tried to watch as many old movies as possible, but Star Wars was sometimes the one franchise to fall back on. Now, he understood why. Yeah, I guess it did, Peter said, chuckling, but now it's something else you and I have enjoyed doing together. I get to cherish the memories with Uncle Ben and make new ones with you. At least that's what Aunt May told me. Well, she's right, Tony said. Just because your aunt and uncle are gone now doesn't mean you can't cherish the memories and make new ones with others, you know? Yeah, but I still miss him, both of them, and that's perfectly normal, Pete. Tony rubbed his back. Now, you have the memories to comfort you. You, Pepper, and I will make new ones. If it all goes well, of course, Tony added mentally. You're right, Tony, Peter finally said. Of course, I am, Tony said, smirking, and don't you forget it. Your aunt always knew what she was talking about, and so do I. Peter chuckled as he wrapped the frame in bubble wrap before placing it in the box. He sniffled again as Tony moved from the bed to the floor to sit next to Peter, wrapping his arm around the boy so that Peter was resting his head on his shoulder. He closed his eyes, feeling the warmth and comfort Tony provided him with one simple gesture. Ever since Tony became his mentor all those months ago, there was always warmth, a comfort he slowly found with the billionaire himself, a comfort that offered safety, affection, and care. They both care very deeply about you, and just so you know, kid, Tony finally whispered into his brown hair, you can talk to us about May, Ben, your parents anytime. I want to hear more about them. Really? Peter asked, not lifting his head. Yep, Tony said. I mean, I'm not the best point of reference when it comes to grief, but sharing memories, talking about them, it's helpful. It keeps them alive. He pointed to Peter's chest, in here, and then moved his finger to Peter's forehead, and here. Peter gave a small smile as tears came into his eyes. Thanks, Tony. You're welcome, buddy, the billionaire said. You guys doing okay in here? A voice suddenly said, jolting Tony and Peter out of their thoughts. They looked up from where they were sitting on the floor and found Pepper standing in the doorway smiling. I just finished cleaning the fridge and figured I'd come check on you too. Sorry, Pepper, Peter said, wiping his eyes. It was my fault. He watched as the blonde woman walked in and sat down in front of them. I got caught up in, reminiscing. It's okay, Peter, she said, patting him on the knee. You know, I would love to hear more about your uncle, if that's okay. You can tell us more about it while we finish packing. Yeah, that'd be great, Peter said, smiling. Sharing the memories, reliving the nostalgia seemed to give Peter some strength as they finished packing up the things in his bedroom. While there was moments where he felt the grief wash over him, Pepper and Tony, his guardian, were quick to rush in and comfort him. However, he still tried his best to hide it, knowing that they had a lot to get done today, despite his guardian and said guardian's fiancé trying to tell him that there was no rush. Although, there was a part of him that wanted to slow down the packing. It was getting harder and harder knowing that the time to leave the very apartment he and May shared, the last place May was in. However, within 2 hours, his things were packed away in boxes in the trunk of Tony's car and the U-Haul they rented. With the exception of the furniture and the bare mattress, his room was completely barren, almost as if he never lived in it in the first place. After grabbing a few things for May, her jewelry, a dress for her, A few other trinkets Peter picked out. It was finally time to go. Tony told him that they could come back to take care of the furniture another day, and that he would work things out with the superintendent of the building. Trusting Tony like always, Peter accepted it and nodded as the tears brimmed in his eyes. Thankfully, Peter didn't have to necessarily ask for a moment alone when Tony and Pepper told him to make sure he didn't forget anything and that they would wait for him in the car downstairs. Once Pepper and Tony made their way downstairs, Peter stood in the doorway of the apartment looking around, taking in as much as he could before the apartment was completely empty. The knowledge that he would never come back to sleep in there, never see May walk in through the front door, cook in the kitchen, tidy it up for someone coming over, in just a matter of seconds, on one night, all of that he and May shared and knew, changed, and it was never going back to how it was ever again. Tears streamed down his face as he took a shaky breath, forcing himself to prepare to leave. "I won't ever forget this place, Aunt May," he whispered. "I will keep you alive in my memories like we did for Uncle Ben, I promise." He took a deep breath and closed the door behind him, locking it before slowly releasing the knob and walking down the hall to meet Tony and Pepper at the car. The rest of the day didn't do all that much to ease his grief, and it wasn't that he expected it to, seeing as how he had to make arrangements for his aunt. Pepper and Tony of course kept their word and helped him out as much as they could. If Tony or Pepper sensed that he was struggling, one of them stepped in, made a suggestion, and did most of the talking with the funeral director. After a couple of hours, they were finally finished with the arrangements. The wake was set for Wednesday, and the funeral was set for Thursday morning. "That was the hardest thing to do in my life," Peter said aloud, looking out the window of the car, watching complete strangers pass by on the sidewalks. They were completely unaware of a great person dying. He couldn't help but marvel how one was caught up in his or her personal bubble. He could feel Tony looking at him in the rearview mirror. And the funeral hasn't even happened yet. "I know, Peter," Pepper said, reaching back and taking his hand into hers. She wanted to tell him that it was going to be okay, but how could she? "You're not alone in this, kiddo," Tony said, looking him in the eyes from the rearview mirror. "We're right there with you." Peter nodded. "I know," he said. "Believe me, I do." He gripped Pepper's hand, careful not to hurt her with his super strength. "Listen, I know I didn't say it a lot today, but I really want to thank you for all your help today. I'm sorry, I was." No apologies, kid," Tony quickly said. "I'm going to start charging you for every apology you don't need to make, and I'm a billionaire. I can make it happen." Peter chuckled through his tears. "Kid, I'm telling you, we want to do this," Tony said, smiling. "Okay," Peter said quietly, leaning back in his seat. "You know what I think?" Tony finally said after a moment of silence. "What?" Pepper said, chuckling. Peter couldn't help but notice that she seemed to know exactly what he was going to say. "I think we should get some shawarmas," Tony replied with a knowing smile, "and head back to the tower and have a movie night. Thoughts?" "I think I like that idea," Peter said with a small smile. "What about you, Pepper?" "I think I like that idea, too," Pepper replied. The two superheroes and Pepper enjoyed a late lunch at shawarmas before finally heading back to the tower, where they enjoyed a marathon of Star Wars movies. It had been a few weeks since Tony and Peter had their last one, before May died, and it was now the first official movie night Pepper had the opportunity to join in on the fun. Soon enough, dinner arrived as they continued the marathon, eating Thai food, Peter's idea to honor May, which Tony and Pepper had no problem with. The Star Wars movie marathon continued until around 11 p.m. when Peter began to nod off, and the three of them agreed to continue the marathon tomorrow night after dinner with Happy and Rhodey. He wasn't kidding when he said that today was hard, Tony mused aloud as soon as he was sure Peter was in his bedroom out of earshot. The kid exchanged his good nights with them and dragged his feet to get ready for bed. "Nobody said it would be easy," Pepper said quietly. "If someone ever did, they're crazy," Tony retorted as he wrapped an arm around Pepper, kissing the top of her head. "Thank you though. For being there today. You didn't have to, and I know this isn't what you." "Tony, Peter is a part of your life now. He has been for a while," she interjected, looking at him. "That means that he's a part of mine too. I'm standing by you two through thick and thin. It's what couples do, what married couples do." The billionaire smiled. "For better or for worse," he said, taking her left hand with the engagement ring, the very same ring Happy had been holding onto since 2008. "I think you and Rhodey were right. It's not going to be easy, And there will be some bumps, but we'll get through it, as a family.